While my daughter-in-law Madison shoved her plate aside and called my late wife's heirloom a piece of cheap fake silver, I stayed perfectly quiet. 2 days later, when the premier antique dealer in Manhattan locked his doors, turned pale, and begged me not to leave the store, I knew her arrogant mistake was about to cost her millions. I am Clifford Jenkins, 75 years old, and a man who learned a long time ago that silence is louder than screaming. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach ungrateful family members a lesson they will never forget. Let me tell you how a simple family dinner turned into the biggest mistake my son and his wife ever made. The dining room felt as cold as a hospital waiting area. Madison had replaced all of Vivian's warm mahogany furniture with harsh glass and steel the moment she and my son David moved in with me. We were sitting at the dinner table in the home I had owned for 40 years. I was quietly holding my late wife's antique pocket watch in my hands, rubbing my thumb over the worn metal. It brought me comfort. Madison, however, looked at me like I was an infection in her pristine house. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and snatched the watch right out of my hands. I barely had time to react before she dropped it onto the glass table with a loud clatter. "Dad, throw this cheap fake silver away," she said, rolling her pale blue eyes. "It is ruining the aesthetic of my new sofa. You leave it sitting around everywhere like trash. And while we are on the subject, you need to pack your bags for the guest house out back. I need the master bedroom to host elite investors for my fashion brand this weekend." I looked at her blonde hair and her designer clothes bought with money she did not actually have. She was demanding I leave the bedroom I had shared with my wife for decades so she could impress strangers. My chest tightened, but I kept my face entirely blank. I did not yell. I did not demand respect. At 75 years old, as a black man who has seen the worst of this world, I knew that losing my temper would only give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, I slowly turned my gaze to my son. David was 40 years old, sitting at the head of my table eating his steak as if his wife had not just insulted his mother's memory and kicked his father out of his own bedroom. I waited for him to speak. I waited for the boy I raised to become a man and defend his family. David finally stopped chewing and wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He did not look me in the eyes. Instead, he reached down into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of banking documents. He slid the heavy pile of paper across the glass table until it hit my plate. "Just sign the second mortgage, Dad," he said, his voice completely devoid of any shame. "Madison's company is bleeding cash, and we need your house as collateral to keep it afloat. The bank needs your signature by tomorrow morning." I looked at the thick stack of papers, and then back at my son. They were not asking. They were demanding. They wanted to take my master bedroom, throw me into a drafty guest house, and put a lien on the property I had worked my entire life to pay off, all to fund a failing fashion boutique for a woman who despised me. "Dad, please," David added, pushing a pen toward me. "It is just a formality. We will pay the mortgage back as soon as the investors bite. You are not really using the equity anyway." The audacity hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. A father knows when he has lost his son. I saw nothing but weakness and greed in David's eyes. He had sold his soul to please a woman who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle taking up prime real estate. I did not argue. I did not reach for the pen. I calmly reached across the table, picked up Vivian's pocket watch, and put it safely into my breast pocket. I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the dining room, leaving them sitting in absolute silence. I walked into the master bedroom, the room they planned to strip from me by tomorrow. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully took the watch out of my pocket. I used my cotton handkerchief to gently wipe away the smudge Madison's fingers had left on the intricate metal casing. I looked up at the framed photograph of Vivian on my nightstand. Her beautiful dark skin and bright smile seemed to warm the cold room. Madison thought this watch was cheap fake silver. She thought I was just an ignorant old retired mechanic who got lucky with a piece of property. What Madison did not know was the history etched into the very foundation of this house. Back in the 1970s, Chicago was a brutal place for a young African-American couple trying to buy a home in a good neighborhood. The banks redlined us. The real estate agents lied to us. But Vivian and I worked double shifts. We saved every single penny. We fought tooth and nail against a system designed to keep us in the slums, and we bought this property with cash and sheer willpower. This house was our fortress, and this watch was not some thrift store junk. It was Vivian's most prized family heirloom passed down from a grandfather who had worked on the luxury railroads. I held the heavy metal in my palm, feeling the quiet power of my history. Madison and David thought they could just erase me. They thought I was a senile old fool who would sign away his life out of blind loyalty. They underestimated the quiet strength of a man who built his life from absolutely nothing. I promised Vivian I would protect our legacy, and I intended to keep that promise. Later that night, the house was completely silent. Madison and David had gone to sleep, likely dreaming of the money they planned to extract from me the next day. I needed a glass of water and walked quietly down the long hallway toward the kitchen. As I passed the entryway coat rack, I noticed David's expensive cashmere coat hanging haphazardly over the hook. Sticking out of the inside pocket was a thick, crumpled manila envelope. It was marked with a bright red stamp that said urgent and confidential. Something in my gut, a deep instinct honed over decades of surviving hard times, told me to look inside. I carefully pulled the envelope from his coat and slipped into my study, closing the door softly behind me. I turned on the small desk lamp and opened the flap. It was not a bank statement. It was not a letter from a legitimate financial institution. It was a default notice for a loan of $500,000. I read the violent, aggressive language on the paper and my blood ran cold. This was from an underground lending syndicate. Loan sharks. Ruthless criminals who did not send collection agencies when you missed a payment, they sent men to break your legs. David had borrowed $500,000 from the worst kind of people to fund his wife's failing vanity project, and he had defaulted. But that was not what made my heart stop. I flipped to the very last page of the contract where the terms of the collateral were listed. Under the section labeled Primary Guarantor was my name, Clifford Jenkins. And right next to my printed name was a signature, a perfect, flawless forgery of my own handwriting. I sat back in my leather chair staring at the ink. David had not just asked me for a mortgage at dinner. He had already committed federal fraud. He had forged my signature to secure a massive illegal loan, and now that he was defaulting, he was trying to get a legitimate bank mortgage to pay off the underground syndicate before they came for his head. He had literally put a target on my back and mortgaged my life to save his own skin. I looked at the forged signature again. A profound coldness washed over me. The boy I had raised, the son I had loved, was gone. He was willing to let dangerous criminals take my home and potentially my life just to keep up appearances with his elitist wife. I folded the paper and put it back into the envelope. I walked quietly back to the hallway and slipped it right back into David's coat pocket exactly as I had found it. I was not going to confront him. Confrontation would give him a chance to run, or lie, or prepare. Instead, I walked back to my bedroom and looked at the pocket watch sitting on my dresser. Madison thought it was fake silver. David thought I was a fool. Tomorrow morning I was going to take this watch to the best appraiser in the city, and then I was going to show them exactly what happens when you mistake a father's silence for weakness. I woke up before the sun even had a chance to touch the city skyline. The house was completely silent. David and Madison were still asleep, entirely unaware that the old man they thought they had trapped was already making his first move. I dressed in a simple pressed suit. Nothing flashy, just the quiet dignity Vivian always loved. I slipped the pocket watch into my inner breast pocket, feeling its reassuring weight against my chest, and walked out the front door into the crisp morning air. I hailed a yellow cab and gave the driver an address in the heart of Manhattan. The ride from our quiet neighborhood to the bustling, high-security streets of the Diamond District gave me time to think. I watched the city blur past the window. My son had forged my signature to borrow $500,000 from dangerous criminals. His wife wanted to throw me into a guest house and treat me like a burden. They thought I was just an old, tired African-American man who would roll over and surrender his life's work. They were severely mistaken. The cab pulled up to a discreet, heavily fortified building on 47th Street. There were no neon signs here, just thick, bulletproof glass and a small brass plaque that read, Abramowitz Antiquities. Mr. Abramowitz was a master dealer, a man who had handled the estates of billionaires and historical figures. Vivian had always told me that if I ever needed to know the true history of her grandfather's watch, Abramowitz was the only man in the city I could trust. I pressed the security buzzer, waited for the heavy magnetic click of the lock, and stepped inside the quiet velvet-lined showroom. The shop smelled of old paper leather and polishing wax. Mr. Abramowitz, an older gentleman with sharp eyes and a neatly trimmed gray beard, was sitting behind a thick glass counter. He looked up from his ledger and offered a polite professional nod. "Good morning, sir," he said, his voice calm and measured. "How may I assist you today?" I walked up to the counter and carefully pulled the pocket watch from my coat. I placed it gently on the black velvet mat between us. "I need an appraisal," I said quietly. "My daughter-in-law recently told me this was nothing but a cheap piece of fake silver. I want to know exactly what I am holding." Abramowitz smiled politely, the kind of smile an expert gives when humoring a novice. He reached into his drawer, pulled out a jeweler's loop, and fitted it over his right eye. He picked up the watch. For the first 5 seconds, he was completely relaxed. Then he turned the watch over to examine the intricate engraving on the back casing. His breathing suddenly stopped. I watched as his fingers, which had been perfectly steady a moment before, began to tremble. He quickly moved the watch under a high-intensity halogen lamp on his desk. He adjusted his loop, leaning in so close his nose almost touched the metal. He stayed like that for a full minute, absolutely paralyzed. When he finally looked up at me, all the color had completely drained from his face. He looked ghostly pale, as if he had just seen a phantom. He did not say a single word to me. Instead, he slammed his hand down on a red button under his desk. Immediately, the heavy steel security shutters slammed down over the front windows of the shop, blocking out the morning sunlight and the view of the street. The magnetic locks on the front door engaged with a loud, heavy thud. The open sign flipped to closed. He rushed out from behind the counter, checking the locks manually, his chest heaving with sudden panic. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice dropping to a frantic, breathless whisper, "do not move. Do not leave this store." I stood there perfectly still, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. "Why did you lock the doors?" I asked, keeping my voice as calm as still water. Abramowitz wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Because, sir, you have no idea what you have just brought into my shop, and if the wrong people know you have it, you will not make it home alive today." Abramowitz walked back behind the reinforced counter, treating the watch as if it were a fragile explosive. He took a deep, shaky breath to compose himself. "Mr. Jenkins," he began, his voice still trembling with awe and fear, "your daughter-in-law is a fool. This is not fake silver. It is not even silver at all." I waited, letting the silence draw out the truth. "What you are looking at is solid, unalloyed platinum," he explained, pointing a trembling finger at the casing. "This is a 1925 Vacheron Constantin. It is a masterpiece of horology, a one-of-a-kind commission. It was custom-made in Switzerland for a prominent American railroad tycoon during the Roaring '20s. I thought about Vivian. I thought about her grandfather, who had worked tirelessly on those very railroads enduring the harsh racism and grueling labor of the era. He had been a man of immense dignity, a man who had somehow acquired this masterpiece and kept it hidden from a world that would have torn him down for owning it. He passed it to Vivian, and she passed it to me with the strict instruction to protect our legacy." Abramowitz pressed a tiny, almost invisible latch near the winding crown. The back of the watch popped open, revealing the intricate ticking mechanical heart of the timepiece. But that was not what made me catch my breath. Set flawlessly into the inner gears and plates were dozens of pristine, perfectly cut diamonds. They caught the light of the halogen lamp, glittering like a constellation of hidden stars. The tycoon who commissioned this wanted his wealth hidden from the public eye, Abramowitz whispered, mesmerized by the sparkling gears. So the master watchmakers hid flawless internal diamonds inside the mechanism itself. It is a legendary piece. We all thought it was lost to history. I looked at the expert. "Give me a number, Mr. Abramowitz. What is the value of this legacy?" He swallowed hard, looking me dead in the eyes. "Sir, if I put this in an exclusive private auction tomorrow, the bidding would start at $4.5 million minimum." $4.5 million. I felt a heavy, profound weight settle over my shoulders. My wife had left me a fortune sitting quietly in a drawer for decades. But the revelation of the money was not the reason Abramowitz had locked the doors in a panic. He turned to his computer monitor, his face dark with genuine concern. "Mr. Jenkins, the value is astonishing, but that is not why I secured the building." He typed rapidly on his keyboard and turned the screen around to face me. It was a still image from his high-definition security cameras time-stamped yesterday afternoon. My blood ran completely cold. Staring back at me from the screen was Madison, my arrogant, elitist daughter-in-law. She was standing at this exact counter, wearing her designer sunglasses, holding her phone up to show Abramowitz a photograph. "She was in here yesterday," Abramowitz said, his tone turning deadly serious. "She showed me highly detailed pictures of this exact watch. She demanded to know if I could arrange a private, untraceable underground cash sale within 48 hours. She tried to fence your property, Mr. Jenkins. I stared at the image of the woman who had sat at my dinner table and called my wife's heirloom cheap trash. She knew. She knew exactly what it was worth all along. But the worst part was what she said next. Abramowitz continued leaning in closer. I asked her why the owner was not selling it himself. She looked me right in the eye and told me the owner was her senile father-in-law. She said you were suffering from severe violent dementia and that you were being permanently institutionalized in a locked psychiatric facility by the end of this week. The puzzle pieces violently snapped together in my mind. The loan sharks, the forged signature, the sudden demand for my house. Madison and David were not just going to kick me out into the guest house. They were actively plotting to declare me legally insane, lock me away in a mental asylum, and steal $4.5 million right out from under me. They thought I was a helpless old man they could easily dispose of. But as I looked at the security photo, a cold, ruthless clarity washed over me. I thanked Mr. Abramowitz for his time and asked him to keep the watch in his maximum security vault. I walked out of the shop and stepped back onto the bustling streets of Manhattan. They had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. I left the Diamond District with the weight of $4.5 million resting against my chest. A lesser man might have crumbled under the profound weight of that betrayal. A lesser man might have rushed home to confront his son screaming and demanding answers for the forged signatures and the stolen legacy. But I am not a lesser man. I am Clifford Jenkins, and I survived the brutal winters of a city that wanted to see me fail. I did not shed a single tear in that cab ride downtown. Tears are a luxury for people who have the time to mourn a loss. I only had time to prepare for war. I told the cab driver to take me directly to the financial district. I needed a shark right now, not a shoulder to cry on. The towering glass and steel skyscrapers loomed over the avenue as I stepped out onto the pavement, feeling the cold wind hit my face. I walked through the revolving doors of the most ruthless corporate law firm in the state. I did not wait in the lobby to be announced. I did not speak to the receptionist sitting behind the marble desk. I walked straight past the mahogany tables and abstract paintings directly into the corner office of my lead attorney. His name is Garrison. Garrison is a man who dismantles entire corporate empires before he even finishes his morning coffee. He looked up from his massive desk, his sharp eyes taking in my sudden presence without a flinch. I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from him, placing my hands flat on my knees. I laid out the facts with the cold precision of a surgeon operating on a tumor. I told him about the forged loan documents, the underground syndicate breathing down my son's neck, and the fake silver watch that was actually platinum. I told him my son David and his arrogant wife Madison were plotting to completely erase me from my own life. Garrison did not show any pity because he knows I absolutely despise it. Instead, his jaw tightened and he pulled his keyboard closer to him. He asked me for names, dates, and locations. We began to map out a strategy so cold and calculated that it would leave my treacherous family with absolutely nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Garrison cracked his knuckles and began to navigate the secure legal databases that only elite attorneys are permitted to access. His fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for any recent legal filings attached to my name or my property. For several long minutes, the only sound in the sprawling office was the rapid clicking of keys and the low, distant hum of the city traffic outside the floor-to-ceiling window. Then Garrison stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than a concrete block. He turned his large monitor so I could see the screen clearly. Right there in black and white was an emergency petition filed with the county court just 24 hours ago. Madison had submitted a formal request for an adult protective services intervention. She was seeking immediate emergency guardianship over me. I read the legal justifications she had submitted under penalty of perjury. The lies were breathtaking. Madison claimed I was dangerously senile. She wrote that I suffered from aggressive psychotic breaks, that I wandered the streets at night talking to people who were not there, and that I was a severe danger to myself and the surrounding community. She painted a vivid picture of a broken, delusional old man who needed to be locked in a secure psychiatric ward for his own safety. And the petitioner she listed as the sole conservator of my estate was my own son David. They were not just trying to take the house and kick me into the guest room, they were trying to strip me of my basic human rights. If a judge approved this emergency petition, Madison and David would have total legal control over my finances, my property, and my medical decisions. They could legally drag me out of my own home, throw me into a locked facility, and sedate me until I actually did lose my mind. They would sell the house to pay off the dangerous loan sharks and steal Vivian's watch to fund Madison's failing fashion business. The sheer evil of their plan was staggering, but it gave me exactly the ammunition I needed to fight back. I knew their timeline now. They were planning to ambush me with state agents very soon. Garrison closed the court file and leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. He walked over to the espresso machine in the corner of his office, poured a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, and handed it to me. "Drink this, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice full of quiet, deep respect. "You are going to need your energy for what comes next." I took a slow sip, letting the bitter heat steady my nerves and warm my chest. "Mr. Chairman, that is a title Madison has no idea even exists. To my arrogant daughter-in-law, I am nothing but a broke retired mechanic who got lucky buying a cheap house in a neighborhood that eventually gentrified. She genuinely believes my only income is a meager monthly Social Security check. She treats me like a peasant because she thinks I am poor and uneducated. What Madison does not know is that while she plays dress-up with her failing fashion boutique, I own the very ground she walks on every single day. Decades ago, Vivian and I took the small profits from my mechanic shop and bought up abandoned commercial lots across the city. We built a massive real estate portfolio, quietly and strategically holding everything under an anonymous corporate trust to avoid the racism of the era. Madison runs her Little Elite clothing brand out of a prime retail storefront in the wealthy downtown district. She pays $10,000 a month in rent to a faceless property management company. She does not know that I am the sole owner and chairman of that management company. I am literally her landlord. Every time she looks down her nose at my old sweaters, she is entirely oblivious to the fact that I could evict her business with a single phone call. Garrison and I reviewed her lease agreements right then and there. We verified that her business was several months behind on rent and currently in severe breach of contract. I told Garrison to prepare the eviction notices immediately, but to hold them until I gave my signal. I wanted Madison to feel the absolute peak of her false power before I ripped the foundation right out from under her expensive high heels. Before I left the law firm, I gave Garrison one final crucial instruction. I had him arrange for a heavily armored transport to take Vivian's real watch, the $4.5 million platinum masterpiece, directly to a high-security federal vault. Once the extensive paperwork was signed and the priceless heirloom was safely locked behind foot-thick steel, I walked to a cheap tourist gift shop a few blocks away from the law firm. I browsed through dusty displays of plastic souvenirs and mass-produced trinkets until I found exactly what I was looking for. It was a bulky, shiny stainless steel pocket watch. It cost me exactly $50. Exactly. It looked somewhat similar to the real one if you stood far away and knew absolutely nothing about fine horology. I paid the cashier with a crisp bill and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. I took a cab back to my quiet suburban house. The place was completely empty. Madison and David were likely out finalizing their wicked plans for my demise. I walked into my master bedroom, the very room they wanted to steal from me, and I set the cheap $50 replica right in the middle of my nightstand. I left it out in the open, catching the afternoon light, a perfect shiny piece of bait. I knew they were desperate. The loan sharks were breathing down David's neck, and Madison was starving for cash to save her facade. They needed the watch to pay their debts. Now all I had to do was wait patiently in the shadows and watch my own family walk straight into the trap I had laid for them. I was sitting in my favorite armchair sipping my morning tea when the heavy oak front door suddenly swung wide open. The hinges groaned as my son David and his wife Madison barged into my home. They were not alone. Right behind them walked a stern-looking woman wearing a severe gray suit and clutching a thick metal clipboard. Beside her was a nervous man holding a worn leather medical bag. He had the shifty eyes of a man who was getting paid under the table to do dirty work. I placed my teacup on the coaster and watched the theater unfold. Madison immediately threw her hands to her face and let out a loud theatrical sob. "Oh, thank God we are here in time," she cried out, her voice dripping with fake desperation. She turned to the stern woman and pointed a trembling finger directly at me. "Look at him, Agent. He is just sitting there completely disconnected from reality. I tell you, he wanders the house in the middle of the night. He talks to his dead wife as if she is standing right in front of him. He leaves the gas stove on. He is a massive danger to himself and anyone around him. I just want him to be safe in a locked facility where professionals can watch him." I watched her wipe an invisible tear from her cheek. It was a masterful performance worthy of a daytime soap opera. The woman with the clipboard stepped forward and introduced herself as an agent for Adult Protective Services. She explained that they had received an emergency petition claiming I was suffering from severe advanced dementia and experiencing violent psychotic breaks. She told me the man next to her was a state-approved psychiatrist here to evaluate my mental competency for immediate emergency extraction. I looked past the agent and locked eyes with my son. David was standing near the doorway looking down at his expensive shoes. He refused to meet my gaze. The boy I had raised, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, was standing in my living room allowing his wife to orchestrate my kidnapping so they could steal my money and pay off his gambling debts. I did not raise my voice. I simply nodded slowly and invited the doctor to sit down on the sofa across from me. "Let us get this evaluation over with," I said calmly. The sketchy psychiatrist sat down on the edge of the sofa and pulled a notepad from his bag. He did not bother to build any rapport or show any basic human decency. He immediately launched into a rapid-fire assault of condescending memory questions designed to confuse and disorient a vulnerable mind. "Mr. Jenkins, what year is it?" he barked sharply. "Who is the president of the country right now? Can you count backward from 100 by sevens? What did you have for breakfast this morning?" He fired the questions without leaving me any time to answer, blurring the sentences together to artificially induce panic. I decided to play along for a moment. I slumped my shoulders forward and let my hands tremble just a little bit. I looked around the room with wide, confused eyes as if I were struggling to comprehend my surroundings. I mumbled a few incoherent words and pretended to lose my train of thought mid-sentence. I did not do this because I was intimidated. I did this solely to test my son. I wanted to see if there was a single shred of morality left inside David. I wanted to see if watching his own father sit helpless and confused would finally break his cowardly silence. I looked right at David, offering him one last chance to step in and stop this monstrous abuse. David just shifted his weight nervously and looked away, pulling his phone out of his pocket to distract himself. He stood completely silent in the corner, allowing his father to be publicly humiliated and legally stripped of his human rights. A profound coldness settled into my bones. The final cord connecting me to my son snapped and withered away into nothing. Madison was smiling a triumphant, wicked grin. She leaned over to the Adult Protective Services agent and whispered loudly, "You see what I mean? He is completely gone. His mind is just empty. He belongs in a psychiatric ward for his own good." The corrupt doctor scribbled furiously on his notepad, nodding in agreement. "It is a clear case of advanced cognitive decline," he announced to the room with fake clinical authority. "He is unfit to manage his affairs. I will sign the emergency commitment papers right now so you can take him away." That was the exact moment I decided the game was over. I stopped trembling. I rolled my shoulders back and sat up perfectly straight. The sudden shift in my posture was so sharp and commanding that the corrupt doctor actually flinched and dropped his pen. The confused, fragile old man they thought they were dealing with vanished in a single second. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick sealed envelope. I completely ignored the fake psychiatrist and handed the envelope directly to the Adult Protective Services agent. "You might want to review these documents before you allow this fraud to sign any legal paperwork," I told her, my voice echoing with absolute authority. The agent looked surprised but took the envelope and broke the seal. Inside were 3 separate, highly detailed mental health evaluations. They were certified, notarized, and officially stamped. I did not get evaluated by some random doctor on the street. I went to the top 3 leading neurologists in the entire state of New York just yesterday afternoon. They had subjected me to rigorous cognitive testing, brain scans, and comprehensive psychological profiling. The agent read the summary aloud, her voice growing more shocked with every word. "These documents state that Mr. Clifford Jenkins possesses a razor-sharp intellect, exceptional cognitive function, and is in the top 1% of mental acuity for his age bracket. The evaluations explicitly declare him perfectly capable of managing his own financial and medical affairs with absolute total independence." Madison S. Victoria's smile instantly melted into a mask of pure horror. "What is that?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the papers. "Those are fake. He probably bought those off the internet. He is crazy, I tell you." I turned my gaze to the corrupt doctor, who was now sweating profusely. "Tell me, doctor," I said coldly, "how does a man with advanced cognitive decline manage to secure certified evaluations from the chief of neurology at a major medical center?" The doctor swallowed hard, backing away toward the door. The agent turned her furious glare toward the doctor and then toward Madison. "You brought me here under false pretenses," the agent demanded, her voice shaking with righteous anger. These medical evaluations are undeniable and legally binding. This man is perfectly sane. I looked at David, who was now visibly trembling in the corner of the room. You thought you could hire a cheap crook to lock me in a cage and steal my home, I asked him directly. You thought I was just an ignorant old mechanic who would not see this ambush coming from a mile away. I survived a world that tried to crush me before you were even born, David. You and your wife are nothing but amateurs playing a very dangerous game. The Adult Protective Services agent aggressively shoved the clipboard into her bag and stepped right up to Madison's face. Do you have any idea how much trouble you are in? The agent yelled. Filing a false adult abuse report to illegally seize a senior's assets is a severe criminal offense. I am officially flagging your petition as malicious fraud. If I ever see your name on another guardianship filing, I will personally have the district attorney press felony charges against you and your husband. Madison turned beet red. Her entire elite facade crumbled into pure, unhinged rage. She screamed at the agent, waving her arms frantically as the agent and the terrified fake doctor stormed out of my house, slamming the front door behind them. Madison's legal route to steal my $4 million watch and secure my house to pay off their underground loan sharks had just completely failed. She was out of time and out of options. She glared at me with pure hatred, panting like a cornered wild animal. The legal trap did not work, but I knew this was far from over. Desperate people do desperate things. Midnight arrived, bringing a suffocating silence to the house. I was lying in my bed, fully awake, staring at the ceiling. Down the hall in the guest bedroom, they had tried to banish me to Madison, and David were wide awake too. Their desperation was a living, breathing thing seeping through the walls. Through the quiet hum of the central heating, I could hear the frantic, muffled pacing of my son. He was walking back and forth across the hardwood floor, his heavy footsteps betraying his absolute terror. The underground lending syndicate was no longer waiting patiently for their $500,000. They were done playing games with a coward. Suddenly, the sharp buzz of a cell phone vibrating against a wooden nightstand pierced the quiet night. I knew exactly what that sound meant. David had just received a message. I could hear Madison gasp loudly. Through the thin drywall, her panicked whispers carried into the hallway. The loan sharks had sent David a photograph. It was a picture of my house taken from the street just minutes ago. A black car was parked outside in the dark. The message was perfectly clear. They knew where he lived, and they knew where he slept. The syndicate was giving them an ultimate deadline. If they did not pay the massive interest by tomorrow, the men in the black car would come inside and collect their debt in blood. Madison began to hyperventilate. Her elite facade, the arrogant mask she wore to look down on me, completely dissolved into raw animal panic. She hissed at my son, her voice trembling with venom and fear. She told him there was no other way out. She commanded him to go into my bedroom and steal the silver watch right off my nightstand. I heard her telling him that the jeweler she visited yesterday was willing to pay a massive amount of cash for it, no questions asked. She insisted that selling my wife's heirloom would cover the syndicate interest and buy them the time they desperately needed to figure out another scam. She told David to stop being weak and to just go take it. She said I was a confused old man who would probably think I had just misplaced it. She pushed him toward the door, demanding he commit the ultimate betrayal to save her failing lifestyle. I lay perfectly still in the dark. The only light in the room was the pale moonlight spilling through the window curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. Resting right in the center of my wooden nightstand was the shiny stainless steel replica watch. It cost me exactly $50 at a tourist trap, but in the dim light it looked just close enough to the real thing. It was sitting there waiting a silent test of my son's morality. The brass handle of my bedroom door slowly began to turn. The hinges let out a faint, agonizing creak. A sliver of yellow light from the hallway crept across the carpet. I closed my eyes, leaving only the smallest slit open so I could watch the theater of his betrayal unfold. The door opened wider and a dark silhouette slipped into the room. It was David, my own flesh and blood. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had worked double shifts to put through college, was now sneaking into my room like a common street thief. He stood frozen by the door for a long moment. I could hear his ragged, shallow breathing. He was sweating profusely. Even in the darkness, I could see the nervous gleam of perspiration on his forehead. His entire body was trembling violently. A part of him, the tiny remaining fraction of the son I raised, knew that crossing this line meant there was no coming back. He was about to steal his dead mother's most prized possession from his sleeping father. He took a hesitant step forward and then another. The floorboards whined under his weight. He stopped and stared at my face, waiting to see if I would wake up. I kept my breathing slow and rhythmic, perfectly mimicking deep sleep. I offered him zero resistance. I wanted to see if his conscience would stop him. It did not. He crept closer to the bed, his eyes locked on the shiny metallic bait resting on the nightstand. He reached out his hand. His fingers were shaking so badly he almost knocked over my glass of water. He hesitated for one final second, his hand hovering over the fake watch. He looked at my sleeping face one last time, then he snatched the watch off the wood. He clutched it tightly against his chest as if it were his only lifeline. He turned around and practically ran back toward the door, escaping into the hallway and pulling the door shut behind him. The click of the latch echoed in the dark room. He had done it. He had completely sold his soul for $50 of cheap steel. I lay there in the suffocating darkness, listening to his rapid footsteps retreat down the hall. A profound and heavy silence filled the room, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. For a long time I did not move. I just stared at the empty space on the nightstand where the fake watch had been. My mind drifted back through the decades. I remembered the day David was born. I remembered holding his tiny, fragile body in my calloused hands, promising Vivian and the universe that I would protect him from the cruelties of the world. I remembered the brutal winters in Chicago, the racism we endured, the doors that were slammed in our faces. Vivian and I swallowed our pride and broke our backs so David would never have to know what true desperation felt like. We gave him everything we had. We gave him our legacy. And this was how he repaid us, by bringing dangerous criminals to our doorstep and stealing the last physical memory I had of the woman who gave him life. A deep, agonizing sorrow welled up inside me. It was a grief sharper than any physical pain I had ever experienced. In that dark, quiet room, I realized the painful truth. The boy I had raised was dead. He had been dead for a long time, replaced by a hollow, greedy shell of a man who cared only for himself and his arrogant wife. One single, solitary tear escaped my eye. It slid down my cheek, hot and heavy, and soaked silently into my pillow. It was the only tear I would allow myself to shed. I reached up and wiped the moisture from my face with the back of my hand. As I wiped away that tear, something fundamental shifted deep inside my soul. The loving, forgiving father died in that exact moment. The man who made excuses for his son, the man who hoped for redemption, simply ceased to exist. In his place, a cold, unyielding judge took over. My face hardened into stone, my jaw locked, my heart turned to ice. There would be no more second chances. There would be no more grace. They had chosen their path, and now they would have to walk it all the way to their own destruction. I sat up slowly, pushing the heavy blankets aside. I reached over to the empty nightstand and picked up my cell phone. The screen illuminated my hardened face in the dark room. I opened my encrypted messaging application and selected the contact file for Attorney Garrison. My thumbs moved across the digital keyboard with absolute precision and zero hesitation. I typed a single message. The bait is taken, proceed with absolute destruction. I pressed send and watched the small indicator confirm the message was delivered. The trap was now fully sprung. Tomorrow morning, David and Madison would walk into a den of violent loan sharks carrying a worthless piece of junk metal. They would try to trade a $50 fake for a $500,000 debt. They would realize their massive error when it was far too late to run. I turned off my phone and placed it back on the bare wood of the nightstand. I lay back down and closed my eyes, going to sleep feeling nothing but the cold, comforting certainty of the justice that was about to rain down upon them. I was not standing inside that abandoned meatpacking warehouse near the docks that morning. I did not need to be. My attorney Garrison had dispatched a highly trained private investigator to follow my son and his wife the moment their car left my driveway. Through the parabolic microphone pointed at the rusted warehouse windows, I later heard every single arrogant word they spoke. David and Madison walked into that criminal syndicate den as if they were stepping into a luxury hotel lobby. They were completely blinded by their own greed and unearned confidence. The warehouse was dark and smelled of damp concrete and old oil. 5 massive men stood in the shadows waiting for the $500,000 David had borrowed and lost. Madison did not cower. She actually thought her elite status protected her from men who break bones for a living. I heard her high heels clicking aggressively against the concrete floor. She marched right up to the folding table where the syndicate boss was sitting. She did not apologize for the missed payments. She did not beg for extra time. Instead, she reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out the shiny metal watch David had stolen from my nightstand just a few hours earlier. She slammed it down onto the metal table with a loud, clanking thud. Her voice echoed through the empty warehouse, dripping with extreme arrogance. She told the boss that the watch was a priceless historical artifact. She claimed it was worth over $4 million. She looked the violent criminal dead in the eye and ordered him to take his $500,000 out of its value and wire the remaining millions directly into her boutique business account. She actually demanded that the loan sharks give her change. She stood there smiling a smug, victorious smile, truly believing she had just outsmarted an underground crime syndicate using a stolen heirloom. She thought she had won the lottery. She thought she had finally destroyed me and secured her wealthy future. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed a $50 piece of tourist trash to a man who kills people for insulting him. The syndicate boss did not say a word to Madison. He did not even look at her. He simply raised a hand and snapped his fingers. From the shadows of the warehouse, an older man stepped forward. He was the syndicate's private appraiser, a man whose entire life was dedicated to fencing stolen luxury goods and identifying high-value collateral. He carried a small black leather case of tools. He walked up to the metal folding table and picked up the shiny watch. Madison stood with her arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently, waiting for the man to confirm her new status as a multimillionaire. The appraiser pulled a jeweler's loop from his pocket and fitted it over his eye just like Mr. Abramowitz had done the day before. But the reaction was entirely different. The appraiser did not turn pale. He did not lock the doors in a panic. He did not stare in breathless awe at a hidden constellation of flawless internal diamonds. Instead, he let out a low, rumbling chuckle. He pulled a small metal file from his leather kit. Madison shrieked and lunged forward, demanding he stop treating the priceless artifact with such disrespect. The boss signaled his men, and two massive enforcers stepped forward, blocking Madison and David from the table. The appraiser ignored her screaming. He took the metal file and scraped it hard against the back casing of the watch. The shiny silver coating instantly flaked away, revealing dull gray metal underneath. The appraiser dropped the file and burst into a loud, malicious laugh that echoed off the damp warehouse walls. He tossed the watch back onto the metal table. It bounced and landed right at David's feet. The appraiser looked at the syndicate boss and shook his head in pure disgust. He announced to the entire room that there was absolutely no platinum and no diamonds. He told the boss that the watch was nothing but cheap, mass-produced Chinese stainless steel. He laughed again and said the entire piece of junk was worth exactly $50 at a corner store. The silence that fell over the warehouse was heavy and terrifying. Madison's smug, victorious smile was completely wiped from her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost. David froze in sheer, unadulterated horror. His knees began to buckle as he stared at the cheap, scratched metal sitting on the dirty concrete floor. They had stolen the wrong watch. They had walked into a den of violent predators carrying a worthless toy. They had tried to scam men who do not accept apologies. The realization of what they had just done crashed down on them like a collapsing building. They were not millionaires. They were dead meat. The boss slowly stood up from his folding chair. The amusement was entirely gone from the room. He stared at David with eyes as cold as dead winter. The boss did not raise his voice. He did not have to. He simply nodded his head toward David. Before my son could even open his mouth to beg for his life, two enforcers grabbed him by the shoulders. They dragged him violently across the concrete floor and slammed him face first into the metal folding table. David screamed in terror, begging and pleading, swearing that it was a mistake and that his father had tricked him. Madison screamed hysterically, ordering the men to let her husband go. She reached into her purse and pulled out her expensive designer phone, threatening to call the police. One of the enforcers stepped up to her, snatched the phone right out of her trembling hand, and threw it onto the concrete floor. He stomped his heavy boot down, crushing the screen into 1,000 tiny pieces of useless glass. Madison backed away, sobbing and holding her hands up in pure terror. She watched helplessly as the men beat David. They hit him in the ribs and slammed his head against the table, ensuring he felt the full weight of the massive debt he had failed to pay. I listened to the audio recording of my son crying out in pain, and I felt absolutely nothing. He had brought this violent storm upon himself the moment he forged my signature and decided my life was worth less than his gambling debts. The enforcers finally stepped back, leaving David gasping and coughing on the floor. The boss walked over and stood directly above my son. He delivered a deadly ultimatum that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He told David that trying to scam the syndicate with a fake watch was an insult that usually resulted in a body being dumped in the river. But the boss was a businessman and he wanted his money. He leaned down and told David he had exactly 48 hours to bring $500,000 in pure cash. If they did not deliver the money in 2 days, the boss promised that both David and Madison would completely disappear from the face of the earth. The enforcers grabbed David by his torn coat and threw him out the warehouse door onto the dirty street. Madison ran out right behind him, stumbling in her expensive heels, crying and shaking uncontrollably. They fled in absolute terror, rushing back to their car and peeling away from the docks. They had no money. They had no $4 million watch. They had a violent hit ordered on their heads, and the clock was rapidly ticking down. Their plan to steal my wealth and lock me in an asylum had completely imploded, leaving them staring directly into the abyss. David was broken, bleeding, and completely out of options. But Madison was a woman who refused to lose her elite status. Desperation pushed her to the absolute edge. She realized her fashion boutique was doomed, and her husband was useless. She had only one final option left to save her life and her lifestyle. She had to swallow her pride and run to the only people arrogant enough to believe they could fix this mess. She was going to resort to calling her wealthy, elitist parents. I sat by the large bay window in my living room, sipping a cup of chamomile tea. The afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across my manicured front lawn. The neighborhood was quiet and peaceful, just the way Vivian and I had always loved it. Suddenly, the tranquility was shattered by the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. A brand-new, gleaming silver Mercedes-Benz pulled up to my curb, parking illegally across my driveway. I watched closely as the heavy doors swung open. Out stepped Madison's parents. I knew exactly who they were, even though we had only met a handful of times at the wedding. They were the kind of people who wore their wealth like a weapon. The father, Richard, was dressed in a pristine navy suit that cost more than most people make in a month. The mother, Victoria, wore a designer beige trench coat and oversized sunglasses that covered half her face. They stood on my sidewalk and looked up and down my street with visible, absolute disgust. Victoria actually pulled a silk handkerchief from her purse and held it over her nose as if the very air in my neighborhood was contaminated. They looked at the modest but sturdy brick houses surrounding mine with pure contempt. They saw a historically black neighborhood and immediately assumed it was a place of poverty and failure. They had no idea that the people living in these homes were retired doctors, veterans, and hardworking families who had built this community from the ground up. They marched up my cobblestone walkway, their expensive shoes clicking sharply against the stone. Richard did not bother to ring the doorbell gently. He pounded on the heavy oak door with the flat of his fist, demanding immediate entry. I placed my teacup on the side table and took a deep, steadying breath. Madison had clearly run out of options. The loan sharks had given her a deadly ultimatum, and in her absolute terror she had run crying to her wealthy elitist parents to clean up her catastrophic mess. They had come to my home thinking they could bully a tired old man into surrendering his greatest asset. I slowly walked to the front door and pulled it open, putting on a mask of mild, pleasant surprise. Richard pushed past me without a single word of greeting. He walked straight into my living room, bringing the smell of expensive cologne and arrogance into my sanctuary. Victoria followed close behind, refusing to take off her shoes, tracking dirt across the Persian rug Vivian had bought in Morocco 30 years ago. They stood in the center of the room, looking around at my antique furniture and family photographs with complete disdain. Richard did not ask for permission to sit. He dropped his heavy frame onto my velvet sofa and crossed his legs. I walked into the room and stood before them, keeping my posture relaxed and my face entirely neutral. Richard reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek leather checkbook. He unscrewed a gold fountain pen and rapidly scribbled across a check. He ripped the paper from the booklet and threw it violently onto my wooden coffee table. The paper fluttered down and landed right next to a framed picture of my late wife. "Listen to me, old man," Richard barked, his voice laced with venom and impatience. "My daughter is in a temporary financial bind because your worthless son dragged her into a mess. We know about the debt and we are here to handle it. Take that money. It is $50,000. More cash than you have probably ever seen in your entire miserable life. In exchange, you are going to sign the deed of this house over to my holding company today." Victoria leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on her designer handbag. "You should be grateful," she added, her tone dripping with fake pity. "We are doing you a massive favor. You are wasting prime real estate living here alone. This property needs to be developed by people who actually understand its value. Richard pointed a thick finger at my chest. "You are going to sign the house over to save our daughter, and then you are going to pack your cheap bags and go back to the ghetto projects where your kind belongs." He actually said it. He stood in my living room in the house I bought with blood and sweat and told me to go back to the ghetto. He looked at my dark skin and assumed I was a charity case, a slum dweller who got lucky. He thought $50,000 would blind me. He had absolutely no idea that the house he was sitting in was worth over $2 million and that I owned it completely free and clear. He wanted to steal my home to pay off the syndicate debt, and he thought he could buy my entire life with pennies. The sheer racist audacity of his extortion attempt hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He glared at me, expecting me to fall to my knees in gratitude or cower in fear. He expected the old black man to simply obey his wealthy white superiors. I looked down at the $50,000 check resting on my coffee table. A fierce, violent rage boiled deep within my chest, but I did not let a single drop of it show on my face. I did not yell. I did not curse at them or demand they leave my property. That is exactly what they wanted. They wanted me to become the angry, irrational old man so they could justify their cruelty. Instead, I smiled. It was a warm, slow, completely disarming smile. I walked over to the silver tea service resting on the sideboard. I calmly picked up the delicate porcelain teapot and poured 2 fresh cups of hot chamomile tea. The fragrant steam rose into the air, cutting through the tension. I carefully carried the silver tray over to the coffee table and set it down right next to Richard's insulting check. "I am afraid there has been a slight misunderstanding, Richard," I said, my voice as smooth and gentle as polished glass. I picked up the check by the very corner of the paper as if it were a piece of filthy trash. I gently placed it back onto his lap. "I do not need $50,000, and I certainly do not intend to sell my home. Vivian and I planted the rose bushes in the backyard, and I promised her I would watch them bloom every spring. You simply cannot put a price on a promise." Richard turned bright red. The veins in his thick neck bulged against his white collar. He was utterly baffled by my complete lack of submission. Victoria gasped, looking at me as if I had just lost my mind. "You are a stubborn, ignorant old fool," she spat, her voice losing all its false elegance. "You are throwing away a fortune." I kept my warm smile firmly in place. I folded my hands together and looked at them with eyes full of quiet, unwavering peace. I offered them sugar for their tea, acting completely oblivious to their escalating fury. They could not break me. My polite, gentle refusal was a wall of concrete they simply could not shatter. I played the role of the kindly, confused elder to absolute perfection, letting their racist arrogance blind them to the reality of the situation. Richard stood up violently, knocking his knees against my coffee table. He shoved the check back into his pocket, his face twisted in pure hatred. "Come on, Victoria," he growled. "We are leaving. This senile idiot can deal with the loan sharks himself. Let him die in his precious ghetto house." They stormed out of my living room, leaving the front door wide open. I listened to their heavy footsteps echoing down the walkway, followed by the loud screech of their car tires as they sped away down the quiet street. The moment the sound of their engine faded in the distance, my warm smile instantly vanished. My face turned to cold, hard stone. I reached into the deep pocket of my trousers and pulled out a small, black, high-tech audio recording device. The tiny red light on the top was blinking steadily. I pressed a button and the device saved the file. I had recorded every single second of their visit. I had crystal-clear audio of Richard offering me a bribe, demanding my property deed, and threatening me with vile racist slurs. It was a textbook case of criminal extortion and harassment. I walked over to my desk, connected the device to my secure laptop, and attached the audio file to an email. I typed a brief message and sent the entire package directly to a senior federal agent at the FBI. Madison S. parents thought they were untouchable. They had no idea they had just handed me the very evidence I needed to lock them all in a federal prison. 48 hours is a very short amount of time when violent men are waiting to collect a $500,000 debt. Madison was completely out of options. Her attempts to steal my watch had ended in absolute humiliation. Her elitist parents had failed to extort my property deed. The underground syndicate was closing in on her and David with every tick of the clock. So my arrogant daughter-in-law resorted to the only survival tactic she truly understood. She threw a party. She organized a lavish emergency investment gala right inside her high-end fashion boutique. She sent out frantic exclusive invitations to the wealthiest elite in the city, promising them a once-in-a-lifetime ground floor opportunity to buy shares in her brand. It was nothing but a beautiful, desperate scam. I had my private investigators watching the entire setup. The caterers brought in expensive champagne and crystal flutes. The string quartet played soft, elegant music in the corner of the room. Madison had completely maxed out her remaining credit just to rent the lighting and the red carpet, hoping to create an illusion of extreme success. She needed $500,000 in pure cash by tomorrow morning to save her life and the life of her husband. She invited venture capitalists, trust fund heirs, and naive socialites intending to sell them worthless equity in a company that was already drowning in massive debt. She was throwing a grand theatrical performance to steal their money and hand it directly over to the loan sharks. The sheer audacity of her plan was almost impressive, but it was built on a foundation of lies and panic. Through the large glass windows of the boutique, my investigators watched her mingling with the wealthy guests. She wore a stunning white designer gown, holding a glass of champagne and laughing loudly, but beneath the heavy makeup and the perfect smile, she was visibly shaking. The clock was ticking down to 0, and she was desperately searching the room for a savior with an open checkbook. Halfway through the evening, the soft music faded away and Madison stepped up onto a small illuminated stage in the center of the boutique. She tapped her crystal champagne glass with a silver spoon to get the attention of the wealthy crowd. The room fell silent as the elite investors turned their eyes toward her. She took a deep breath and let her shoulders drop, putting on the absolute performance of her life. She did not start by talking about fashion or profit margins. She started by crying. Real heavy tears rolled down her cheeks, ruining her expensive makeup. She looked out at the audience with a perfectly crafted expression of tragic vulnerability. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I invited you here not just as potential business partners, but as trusted friends. My husband David and I are going through the most difficult season of our lives." She paused, wiping a tear away with a silk handkerchief. She told the crowd that she was standing before them as the sole heir and manager of the vast Jenkins estate. She lied to their faces, claiming that my son and she had recently taken over a massive real estate portfolio. But then she lowered her head and let out a broken sob. She told them that her beloved father-in-law had tragically lost his mind. She spun a devastating tale about an old man suffering from violent psychotic breaks, wandering the streets and completely disconnected from reality. She painted herself as the heroic, devoted daughter-in-law who was sacrificing everything to care for a sick, senile old man. She claimed that my sudden illness had temporarily frozen their massive family assets in probate court, tying up millions of dollars in legal red tape. She said she needed emergency bridge funding tonight to keep her global fashion brand expanding while she dealt with this heartbreaking family tragedy. The lie was so perfectly delivered, so drenched in emotional manipulation, that the audience was completely captivated. I listened to the live audio feed through the earpiece provided by my investigator. I heard the collective sympathetic gasps from the crowd. I heard wealthy socialites whispering about how brave and strong she was. Madison promised them triple returns on their investments the moment my supposed estate was officially transferred into her name. She was selling my life, my sanity, and my hard-earned legacy to the highest bidder just to save her own skin. The emotional extortion worked flawlessly. Wealthy investors began reaching into their tailored jackets and designer purses, pulling out their checkbooks and luxury pens. They were so moved by her fake tears and the promise of massive returns that they were literally lining up to hand her hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was moments away from getting exactly what she needed to pay off the syndicate. While the elite guests were busy writing out their massive checks, a long, sleek black town car pulled up to the curb right outside the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the boutique. The heavy tinted doors opened, and I stepped out into the cool night air. I was not wearing my old faded cardigans or the worn-out mechanic's boots that Madison loved to mock. I was not the quiet, invisible old man who sat silently at the dinner table taking her insults. Tonight I was dressed for absolute war. I wore a custom-tailored $10,000 Italian wool suit in deep charcoal gray. My shoes were polished obsidian leather, and my posture was as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. I looked exactly like the corporate king I truly was. I buttoned my jacket with calm, deliberate precision, feeling the immense power of my own truth. I was not alone. Stepping out of the car right behind me was my lead attorney Garrison, holding a thick leather briefcase packed with certified legal destruction. On my other side was Mr. Abramowitz, the master antique dealer, carrying a secure velvet lockbox. We stood together on the sidewalk, a trinity of absolute justice, ready to dismantle her entire fraudulent world. The streetlights caught the sharp lines of my tailored suit as we walked shoulder to shoulder toward the entrance of the boutique. Through the glass, I could see Madison standing on the stage, smiling brightly as she collected the checks from the gullible investors. She thought she had won. She thought the senile old man was sitting safely at home, completely unaware that his name was being used to fund a criminal scam. She thought she had outsmarted the loan sharks and secured her lavish future. She had absolutely no idea that the real landlord, the true owner of the very ground she was standing on, was walking right up to her front door. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who owns everything in his path. Every step I took felt like a hammer striking the final nails into her coffin. We reached the heavy glass doors of the boutique. I did not knock, and I did not wait to be invited inside. I placed both my hands flat against the heavy glass doors and pushed them wide open with a forceful, resounding crash. The heavy doors slammed against the interior walls, sending a violent shockwave through the elegant room. The sudden noise was so loud that the string quartet immediately stopped playing mid-note. The wealthy investors froze in place, dropping their luxury pens and turning their heads toward the entrance in absolute shock. The warm, cheerful atmosphere in the boutique instantly plummeted, dropping to a freezing, dead silence. Madison stood frozen on the brightly lit stage. The fake smile completely melted off her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a terrified ghost. She stared at the tall, powerful man standing in the doorway wearing a $10,000 suit. It took her brain several agonizing seconds to process that the commanding corporate titan standing before her was the exact same old man she had just claimed was a psychotic, senile burden. I stepped fully into the room, my eyes locked directly onto hers, and the real reckoning finally began. The heavy glass doors shut behind me, sealing the fate of everyone inside the room. Madison stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Her brain was completely short-circuiting. She could not comprehend how the supposedly senile old man she left at home was now standing in her high-end boutique wearing an immaculate bespoke suit. Panic set in. Pure, unadulterated panic. She gripped the microphone so hard her knuckles turned white. She pointed a trembling manicured finger right at my chest and screamed into the microphone, her voice shrill and hysterical. "Security. Security, get in here right now. Throw this crazy old man out into the street. He wandered off from home. He is severely sick and delusional. Get him away from my investors." Her shrill voice echoed off the high ceilings, bouncing over the heads of the confused, wealthy elite. She was doubling down on her disgusting lie, desperately trying to maintain the illusion that I was just a broken burden. Two massive security guards dressed in black suits immediately responded to her frantic commands. They abandoned their posts at the corners of the room and began charging straight toward me. They lowered their shoulders, preparing to physically grab a 75-year-old man and drag him out onto the sidewalk like a piece of garbage. They thought they were doing their job, protecting a high society gala from a wandering lunatic. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. I stood my ground, looking at the approaching guards with the cold, calm certainty of a man who owns the very air they are breathing. I just waited for the inevitable realization to hit them. Before the two heavy-set security guards could even lay a single finger on my tailored jacket, a frantic voice shattered the tension in the room. "Stop. Stop right there. Do not touch him." The head building manager, a frantic man named Reynolds, sprinted across the polished marble floor faster than I had ever seen a man his size move. He shoved his way through the crowd of wealthy socialites, knocking over a tray of expensive champagne glasses in his absolute terror. He reached the security guards just a fraction of a second before they reached me. Reynolds violently shoved the first guard backward, grabbing the second by the collar and yanking him away from me with brutal force. "Are you out of your minds?" Reynolds screamed at his own security team, his face pale and dripping with cold sweat. "Stand down immediately." The guards stumbled backward, completely bewildered, looking back and forth between their furious boss and the calm old man standing by the door. Madison stood on the stage, her mouth hanging open in pure shock. She clutched the microphone, unable to process why the building manager was physically assaulting his own staff to protect the man she claimed was a wandering lunatic. Reynolds did not even look at Madison. He aggressively smoothed down his suit jacket, took a deep, trembling breath, and turned to face me. He stepped forward and bowed deeply, bending at the waist with a level of profound submission and respect, that sent a massive shockwave through the entire room of investors. "Good evening, Mr. Chairman," Reynolds said, his voice echoing loudly in the dead, silent boutique. "It is an absolute honor to have you visit the property, sir. We were not informed you would be doing a personal inspection tonight. Is there a problem here, sir?" The collective gasp from the wealthy crowd was perfectly synchronized. The investors looked at Reynolds bowing in total submission and then looked at the impeccably dressed African-American man he was addressing as chairman. Madison gripped the microphone stand, her knees buckling slightly. She had paid this building manager a fortune to rent this space, and he was currently treating me like absolute royalty. The sheer impossibility of the moment paralyzed her completely. She tried to speak, but only a pathetic squeak escaped her throat. I walked past the trembling security guards and the bowing building manager without breaking my stride. I approached the brightly illuminated stage where Madison stood completely paralyzed. Her arrogant white knuckles were still gripping the microphone, but she had no voice left to use it. I stepped up onto the platform. I looked her dead in the eyes and gently but firmly pried the microphone right out of her shaking hands. She did not resist. She was entirely frozen in a state of catatonic dread. I turned to face the room full of elite venture capitalists and wealthy socialites. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice deep, resonant, and echoing with absolute corporate authority. "Please allow me to properly introduce myself, since my daughter-in-law seems to have gotten a few crucial details incorrect. My name is Clifford Jenkins. I am the founder, chief executive officer, and sole chairman of the Jenkins Commercial Real Estate Conglomerate." The crowd stood completely motionless. I gave a subtle nod to my attorney Garrison, who was standing by the entrance. He opened his thick leather briefcase, pulled out a wireless drive, and plugged it directly into the boutique's massive presentation screen. The glossy promotional videos of Madison's fashion brand instantly vanished. In their place, massive high-definition images of official commercial property deeds appeared on the wall behind me. They were stamped certified and undeniably authentic. The documents clearly showed the ownership structure of the entire city block. As you can clearly see on the screen behind me, I continued pacing slowly across the stage. I am not a senile old man wandering the streets. I am the sole owner of this entire commercial property. I own the storefront. I own the building. I own the ground you are all currently standing on. The wealthy investors began to murmur among themselves, leaning in to inspect the projected documents. I turned my attention back to the crowd, gesturing toward Madison, who was now trembling so violently she looked like she might collapse. Madison here does not own a massive estate. She does not have millions tied up in probate court. She is merely a tenant in my building. And more importantly, she is a tenant who is currently 4 months behind on her rent and defaulting on a $500,000 loan to an underground criminal syndicate. The gasps from the elite crowd were loud and immediate. The illusion Madison had so carefully crafted over the last 2 years evaporated into thin air. She thought she could play the tragic hero while stealing their investments, but the truth was now projected in bright lights for the entire city elite to see. I turned my microphone back toward the audience, raising my voice to deliver the final devastating blow. Because this tenant has used my property to host a fraudulent investment gala, and because she has engaged in documented criminal activity, I am exercising my absolute authority as the property owner. Madison, your commercial lease is terminated immediately effective tonight. You are being officially evicted for criminal fraud and malicious breach of contract. The wealthy elite did not hesitate for a single second. The sound of expensive checkbooks snapping shut echoed simultaneously across the entire boutique. Golden luxury pens were immediately capped and shoved back into designer purses. The investors who had been shedding tears of sympathy just 5 minutes ago were now glaring at Madison with absolute pure disgust. They realized they had been inches away from handing hundreds of thousands of dollars to a desperate fraudster. They began to aggressively back away from the stage, putting as much distance as possible between their reputations and her sinking ship. Madison fell to her knees right there on the polished hardwood floor. Her pristine white designer gown pooled around her as she covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. She had built her entire identity on the illusion of wealth and superiority, looking down on me because of my skin color and my quiet demeanor. Now she was nothing more than a bankrupt criminal crying on the floor of a building she could no longer afford to rent. Her entire elite facade crumbled to ash in a matter of seconds. She had lost her store, she had lost her scam, and she had lost her dignity in front of the most powerful people in the city. The trap had closed perfectly around her arrogant neck, but the night was not over yet. I looked down at her shaking form, knowing the most painful revelation was still to come. The heavy silence in the boutique was violently shattered by Madison's piercing shriek. She dropped to her knees on the polished marble floor, but the shock only lasted for a fraction of a second before it twisted into pure, unhinged malice. She scrambled back to her feet, her face stained with ruined designer makeup and her pale blue eyes wide with frantic, desperate rage. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest and began to scream at the top of her lungs, completely forgetting the wealthy elite investors who were watching her every single move. She yelled that I had set them up from the very beginning. She screamed that I had deliberately hidden the $4 million platinum watch just to trap them in a cruel game. Her shrill voice echoed through the silent, high-end boutique as she frantically confessed to absolutely everything without even realizing what she was saying. She shrieked that the priceless antique watch belonged to David and that it was their property by legal right. She yelled at the top of her lungs that she knew it was a priceless masterpiece all along and that she only called it cheap fake silver to make me feel utterly worthless, so I would hand it over to her without a fight. The elite crowd gasped in collective horror as she publicly and loudly admitted to her entire manipulative and greedy scheme. She screamed that she had secretly gone to the appraiser behind my back and that she had every right to pawn my property to save her failing business. She confessed to sneaking into my room in the dead of night and forcing David to steal what she thought was the real masterpiece. She stood there panting heavily and glaring at me, completely exposing her own criminal greed to the most powerful people in the city. Her arrogant, flawless mask was completely gone, leaving only a desperate, greedy thief underneath. She had traded her entire life and her freedom for a $50 replica, while the real treasure remained perfectly safe, and she was furious that her brilliant scam had imploded so spectacularly. I watched her thrash and stomp her expensive heels against the floor, acting like a spoiled child who had just been denied her favorite toy. She demanded that I give her the real watch immediately, claiming that she deserved it for putting up with my presence in her house. She completely incriminated herself on every possible level right in front of my lawyer and the silent audience. Mr. Abramowitz stepped out from the shadows behind my attorney. He walked slowly and deliberately to the center of the illuminated stage, carrying a small, pristine black velvet case in his steady hands. The entire room held its collective breath as he released the small brass clasp and opened the heavy lid. Resting safely inside on a bed of dark silk was the real Vacheron Constantin pocket watch. The bright gala lights caught the surface of the solid platinum casing, making it gleam with an undeniable heavy brilliance. Abramowitz carefully lifted the historical masterpiece from its velvet resting place and turned it slowly so the hidden internal diamonds caught the overhead light. The flawless gems sent tiny fractions of sparkling, brilliant light dancing across the stunned faces of the wealthy investors in the crowd. He spoke directly into the microphone, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a master antique jeweler. He confirmed to the dead-silent crowd that the watch Madison tried to steal was a one-of-a-kind historical artifact custom forged in 1925 for a prominent railroad tycoon. He detailed the flawless craftsmanship, the unalloyed platinum structure, and the breathtaking constellation of diamonds hidden deep within the mechanical gears. He announced clearly that if he were to place this exact item in a private exclusive auction tomorrow morning, the absolute minimum opening bid would be $4.5 million. The wealthy socialites whispered in pure awe, realizing they were in the direct presence of true hidden royalty. Madison stared at the glittering watch with a look of starving, pathetic desperation. Her hands twitched violently at her sides as if she wanted to lunge forward across the stage and snatch the multi-million-dollar heirloom right out of the jeweler's careful hands. She had ruined her entire life and doomed her husband to federal prison for a cheap, mass-produced replica, while the real $4.5 million treasure was sitting safely locked away, waiting for this exact moment of ultimate judgment. Abramowitz explained that true wealth does not need to announce itself with flashy logos or arrogant behavior. He told the crowd that the watch was a symbol of quiet, enduring power, and that its true value was reserved only for those who respected its profound history. He carefully placed the heavy platinum timepiece back into its velvet case and snapped the lid shut, sealing away the incredible fortune that Madison had desperately tried to steal. The sound of the case closing echoed sharply, signaling the absolute end of her illusions. The investors who had been ready to write her massive checks just minutes ago now looked at the closed velvet box and then back at her with expressions of profound pity and disgust. They recognized that the quiet old African-American man standing on the stage possessed a level of generational wealth and class that Madison could never even begin to comprehend, let alone steal. Garrison. My lead corporate attorney stepped forward and took the microphone from the jeweler. He opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a heavy stack of legal papers bound by a thick, dark blue ribbon. He announced to the silent room that he was holding the true and final last will and testament of my late wife, Vivian Jenkins. He broke the heavy wax seal and opened the document, spreading it flat across the podium. He read her words aloud, filling the high-end boutique with the undeniable, enduring power of her legacy. He explained to the crowd and to my trembling family that the platinum watch was not merely a highly valuable piece of antique jewelry to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. It was the legal physical key to a massive family trust fund that Vivian and I had established many decades ago. Garrison read the exact financial figures from the official bank statements, confirming that the trust was currently valued at a staggering $15 million. Madison let out a choked, agonizing gasp, falling back onto her hands and knees. $15 million had been sitting in a secure account waiting for the rightful heir. But Garrison was not finished delivering the devastating truth. He read the ironclad legal stipulations Vivian had carefully written into the trust to protect our life work from greedy, treacherous hands. The document clearly stated that the primary heir would only inherit the $15 million if the platinum artifact was never pawned, sold, or illegally leveraged for debt. Furthermore, the will mandated a very specific behavioral clause. It stated that the spouse of the heir must demonstrate absolute, unwavering respect for the Jenkins family legacy and its history. Any attempt to degrade, steal, or misuse the family heirlooms would result in immediate and permanent disqualification from the trust. Garrison explained that Vivian had anticipated that someone might try to take advantage of our son, and she had built an impenetrable legal fortress to ensure our wealth would never fall into the hands of a disrespectful thief. The sheer brilliance of my late wife's foresight left the room completely stunned. She had protected our bloodline from the grave, creating a trap that only a truly wicked and greedy person would ever trigger. Madison listened to the conditions of the will and began to hyperventilate, realizing she had broken every single rule listed on those pages. Garrison slowly lowered the heavy legal document and looked directly down at Madison, who was trembling so violently her teeth were visibly chattering. He spoke with cold, merciless legal precision. He told her that by looking at Vivian's priceless heirloom and calling it fake silver, she had violated the respect clause. He told her that by sending her husband to steal it in the dead of night and by attempting to pawn it to violent underground criminals, she had legally and permanently triggered the absolute disinheritance clause. He looked at David, who was standing paralyzed in the corner of the room, his face completely drained of blood. Garrison announced in a booming voice that because of Madison's boundless greed and David's cowardly compliance, they had forfeited every single penny of their future. "You get absolutely nothing." Garrison declared, his words echoing with total finality. "The entire $15 million trust fund is permanently locked away from you forever." Madison let out a blood-curdling scream of pure agony, realizing her arrogance had just cost her $15 million. The catastrophic reality of losing such an immense fortune shattered her elite facade completely. She collapsed flat against the hardwood floor, wailing in total despair, while the silent crowd watched her ultimate ruin unfold. The devastating reality of losing $15 million crushed Madison completely. She lay on the polished hardwood floor of the boutique, weeping uncontrollably as the elite investors stared down at her in absolute disgust. But the universe was not quite finished delivering its absolute justice for the night. Just as her pathetic sobs echoed through the dead silent room, the heavy glass front doors of the boutique swung open with a violent, deafening crash. The cold night air rushed into the room, bringing with it a chilling sense of impending doom. The elegant string quartet that had been frozen in shock suddenly scrambled backward, knocking over their music stands in pure terror. Walking through the shattered entryway were 5 massive, imposing men dressed in dark leather jackets and heavy boots. These were not security guards, and they were certainly not wealthy investors. They were the ruthless loan sharks from the underground syndicate down by the docks. The men stepped into the bright lights of the high society gala, cracking their heavy knuckles and scanning the room with dead, predatory eyes. The elite socialites and venture capitalists, who had been safely insulated by their wealth, their entire lives suddenly found themselves trapped in a room with actual violent criminals. They began to scream and scramble frantically, pushing each other out of the way to press themselves against the far walls of the boutique. The syndicate boss, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his jaw, walked at the front of the pack. He did not care about the expensive champagne or the designer dresses surrounding him. His cold eyes locked directly onto my son, who was still cowering in the corner. David let out a high-pitched, pathetic whimper and tried to hide behind a rack of silk gowns. The boss signaled his enforcers with a sharp flick of his chin. The massive men began marching straight down the center aisle, shoving a billion-dollar real estate developer out of their way like a rag doll. They had come to collect their $500,000 debt or drag my son out of the building in pieces. The violent, brutal reality of the criminal underworld had just crashed headfirst into Madison's fake high society party, and absolutely nobody was coming to save them. I did not flinch. I did not step back into the shadows, and I certainly did not call for the terrified security guards who were currently hiding behind the catering tables. I simply buttoned the center button of my tailored Italian suit jacket and walked straight through the chaotic crowd of screaming billionaires. I stepped directly into the path of the syndicate boss, blocking his route to my cowardly son. I stood tall and unyielding, an immovable mountain of quiet corporate power. The massive enforcers immediately tensed up, ready to grab an old man by the collar and throw him brutally to the floor, but the boss raised a single leather-gloved hand to stop them. He looked at me closely, sizing up the expensive cut of my suit and the absolute total lack of fear in my eyes. Men who survive in the criminal underworld have a unique sense for recognizing real power when it stands in front of them. I did not raise my voice or show any sign of intimidation. I calmly reached out and handed the criminal boss a sleek, highly secure legal briefcase. He looked down at the heavy case suspiciously for a moment and then slowly popped the brass latches open. Resting neatly inside the velvet-lined interior were a stack of certified legal transfer documents and a crisp, physical cashier's bank draft drawn directly from my corporate conglomerate account. The amount printed clearly on the check was for exactly $500,000. I spoke to the criminal boss in a low, calm voice that carried the absolute, undeniable authority of a man who controls entire city blocks. I explained to him that I had officially and legally purchased my son's entire debt portfolio from his organization. I told him that I had bought the paper, paid the principal, and covered the exorbitant street interest in full. I stated clearly that the debt was now completely settled with his underground syndicate and that he no longer had any business, financial or otherwise, with David or Madison. The mob boss carefully lifted the certified bank draft, inspecting the complex security watermarks and the heavy corporate seals embedded in the paper. A tense, heavy silence hung between us as the violent criminal processed the fact that he was dealing with a legitimate financial titan. He slowly placed the check back into the briefcase and closed the lid with a sharp, satisfying snap. He realized instantly that his money was clean, untraceable, and fully guaranteed without his men having to break a single bone or risk a messy murder charge. The cruel, violent sneer completely faded from his scarred face, replaced by a look of genuine, profound professional respect. He knew he had been completely outplayed by a man who navigated a much higher and far more dangerous level of business. The underground syndicate boss nodded his head silently, an unspoken acknowledgement between two men who understand the absolute currency of power. He tipped his dark hat respectfully to me and gave a quick, sharp whistle to his massive enforcers. The violent men stopped dead in their tracks, turning around in perfect unison. Without saying a single threatening word, they marched straight back out the front doors of the boutique, disappearing into the cold, dark night just as quickly as they had arrived. The heavy glass doors shut behind them, leaving the room in a stunned, breathless vacuum of silence. The wealthy investors slowly lowered their trembling hands, realizing the immediate physical danger had vanished. But the psychological execution was just beginning. I turned around slowly and looked down at my son. David was trembling violently on the hardwood floor, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face. He had fully expected to be beaten to a pulp and dragged away to his death just seconds ago. Now he was looking up at me with wide, pathetic eyes, completely failing to comprehend the magnitude of the trap that had just slammed shut around him. I walked up to him, stopping mere inches from his cowering form. I looked him dead in the eyes, and my voice was as cold and sharp as crushed ice. I did not just cut you off financially, David. I told him so the entire room could hear. I bought your paper. I am now your sole legal creditor. You owe me exactly $500,000 payable immediately. The absolute finality of my words echoed through the boutique. I explained to him that there would be no payment plans, no extensions, and absolutely no fatherly mercy. I owned his debt. I owned the mortgage on his future, and I had the full, unlimited power of a corporate legal team ready to enforce collection. He had tried to steal my property and forge my name to save his own life, and in return, I had legally purchased his entire existence. David collapsed fully onto his knees, hitting the hardwood floor hard. The realization crashed over him like a suffocating tidal wave, tearing away whatever breath he had left in his lungs. He looked up at my cold, unforgiving face and finally understood the absolute crushing magnitude of his situation. I did not just cut him out of the will, I completely owned him. His father legally owned his entire life, his massive debts, and his miserable future with absolutely no escape possible. If he did not pay me $500,000 right now, my attorneys would legally seize everything he possessed and garnish his wages for the rest of his natural life. He was trapped in a financial prison built by his own greed. He opened his mouth to beg for mercy, to plead for the father he had tried to destroy, but no words came out. He was completely drowning in the catastrophic realization that his arrogance had cost him his freedom, his family, and his soul. David knelt on the polished hardwood floor of the boutique, his expensive suit wrinkled and soaked in cold sweat. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that the underground syndicate was gone, but the federal prison was now his absolute reality. The heavy silence in the room was broken by his pathetic sobbing. He crawled forward on his knees, grabbing at the hem of my tailored trousers. He wept openly, a 40-year-old man crying like a frightened child in front of the wealthiest investors in the city. He did not ask for forgiveness like a man who understood his sins. He begged like a coward trying to save his own skin. He pointed a shaking finger at his wife, who was still sitting on the floor in her ruined white gown. He yelled that it was all her idea from the very beginning. He told the room full of staring elites that Madison had manipulated him into doing everything. He cried out that she was the one who forced him to forge my signature on the syndicate loan documents because her fashion brand was collapsing. He confessed loudly that the Adult Protective Services ambush and the fake psychiatric evaluation were entirely her master plan to steal the platinum watch and the estate. He kept pointing at her, blaming her for the cruelty, saying she had threatened to leave him if he did not go along with the conservatorship. He claimed he never wanted to hurt me and that he was just a victim of a manipulative, greedy woman. He looked back up at my face, tears streaming down his cheeks, begging me to protect him from the police. He pleaded with me, saying he loved me and that he was my only son. He asked me to use my power as the chairman of the real estate conglomerate to make the fraud charges disappear. He swore he would divorce her tomorrow and dedicate the rest of his life to making it up to me. He sobbed about the late nights she spent plotting my demise. He swore he tried to stop her when she hired the corrupt doctor. He claimed he only stole the replica watch from my nightstand because she told him they would be murdered by the loan sharks if he failed. He begged the investors to believe him, painting himself as a helpless hostage in his own marriage. He wept that the massive debt was not his fault, but a burden she placed on his shoulders. He asked me to remember the days when he was a little boy playing in the backyard. Vivian and I bought for him. He tried to weaponize my love for his deceased mother, using Vivian's memory as a shield against the incoming legal storm. He cried that Vivian would want me to forgive him and save him from the consequences of Madison's criminal mind. The sheer desperation in his voice echoed off the high ceilings of the boutique, making every single person in the room recoil in absolute revulsion. He was a pathetic, broken shell of a man who refused to take a single ounce of responsibility for his own actions. Madison heard him shifting all the blame onto her, and her shock instantly morphed into pure, unhinged fury. She scrambled to her feet, her face bright red with uncontrollable anger. She completely abandoned any remaining shred of her elegant high society persona. She lunged across the polished floor and tackled David right in front of my feet. She grabbed the collar of his expensive suit and began striking his chest, screaming at the top of her lungs. The wealthy elite guests stepped back in horror as the beautiful couple violently physically turned on each other. She shrieked that he was a pathetic liar and a degenerate coward. She turned her head toward the terrified investors and exposed his deepest, darkest secrets to the entire room. She yelled that the underground syndicate loan was never for her fashion business. She confessed to the crowd that David was a severe gambling addict who had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars on illegal sports betting and underground poker games. She screamed that he had drained their joint bank accounts to pay off his bookies long before she ever suggested taking out a loan against my house. She told everyone that David was a massive failure who could not even afford the luxury car he drove because the bank was actively trying to repossess it. She hit his shoulder again and screamed that the forged signature was entirely his idea, because he was too terrified to ask his father for the money. She ripped away the last remaining pieces of his dignity, revealing that he had been stealing cash from her boutique register just to fund his gambling addiction. David tried to push her off, but she clawed at his jacket, completely destroying the fabric. She screamed that she only married him because she thought he was the sole heir to a massive real estate fortune, but instead she got stuck with a broke, pathetic loser who was willing to sell his own father's mine to save himself from loan sharks. She yelled that she hated him and that he was the most disgusting excuse for a man she had ever met. She confessed that he was the one who researched the corrupt psychiatrist because he was desperate to get his hands on the $15 million trust fund to pay off his massive gambling debts. She kicked his leg and told the investors that every single word that came out of his mouth was a desperate manipulation. She yelled that he had willingly driven the car to the loan sharks and that he had gladly handed over the fake watch hoping to walk away a rich man. She made sure every wealthy person in the room knew that David was a toxic liability. She screamed that she would gladly testify against him in federal court if it meant she could reduce her own prison sentence. She looked around the boutique, her eyes wild and frantic, begging anyone to believe that she was the true victim of a degenerate gambler. But the crowd simply stared at the two criminals, tearing each other apart with absolute disgust. Their marriage did not just end. It violently shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces right there in front of the flashing cameras of the socialites who were now recording the entire disgraceful meltdown on their phones. I stood completely still and watched the two of them destroy each other on the floor of my commercial property. I did not intervene. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness or regret. The father who had loved David, the father who had worked double shifts in the bitter Chicago cold to put food on his plate, had died the moment I saw that forged signature. I looked down at the sobbing, pathetic man crawling at my feet, and my eyes were completely devoid of any warmth or pity. David reached a trembling hand toward my polished shoes, begging me one last time to look at him as a son. He pleaded with me to remember the boy I raised and to grant him the mercy he never once considered granting me. I stared at his tear-stained face and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow certainty. I buttoned my tailored suit jacket, looking down at him from a height he would never in his miserable life reach. I spoke slowly, and my voice cut through the silent boutique like a sharpened blade of ice. A man who sells his own father's sanity to please a thief is no son of mine, I told him. You made your choice when you brought criminals to my door, and you sealed your fate when you tried to lock me in a cage. You are nothing to me now but a debtor who owes me $500,000. I told him that Vivian would look upon his cowardice with absolute shame. I explained that a real man accepts the consequences of his actions, but a coward begs for salvation from the very person he tried to destroy. I took a deliberate step backward, removing myself entirely from his reach. He collapsed against the hardwood floor, wailing in pure despair as the reality of his complete disownment washed over his broken mind. I turned my back to him, erasing him permanently from my life and my legacy. Just as David buried his face in his hands, weeping over the massive fortune and the family he had permanently lost, the heavy silence of the night was suddenly broken. A sharp, piercing wail began to echo from the distant city streets. The sound grew louder and more frantic, rapidly approaching the boutique. It was the distinct, overlapping scream of multiple police sirens tearing through the quiet commercial district. Madison froze her head, snapping toward the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. David stopped sobbing, his entire body going completely rigid with fresh terror. The wealthy investors murmured and began to step back toward the walls, clearing a wide path to the entrance. Suddenly, the dark street outside the boutique was violently illuminated. Bright, flashing red and blue lights pierced through the glass storefront, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the polished hardwood floors and the pale faces of the two criminals. The heavy tires of armored police cruisers and unmarked federal vehicles screeched to a halt right on the curb, blocking every single possible escape route. The law had finally arrived, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. The flashing lights danced across my calm face as I stood waiting for the inevitable justice to be served. The red and blue lights flashing through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the boutique were completely blinding. For a single heartbeat, the entire room stood frozen in absolute terror. Then the heavy front doors were violently thrown open. They did not just walk into the gala, they stormed the building with the overwhelming force of a federal raid. Over a dozen law enforcement officers poured into the room, Local police officers in dark uniforms secured the perimeter, blocking every single exit, while men and women in tactical windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI marched directly down the center aisle. The heavy thud of their tactical boots against the polished hardwood floors echoed like a military drumbeat, signaling the absolute end of the line. The wealthy elite investors, the socialites, and the venture capitalists who had been ready to hand over their fortunes just minutes ago now backed away in sheer panic. They pressed themselves flat against the boutique walls, holding their breath and clutching their designer coats. Nobody dared to speak. Nobody dared to move. The sheer presence of federal agents in a high society event was completely paralyzing. The lead FBI agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face carved from stone, stepped forward and held up his golden badge for the entire room to see. The silence in the boutique was so deep and absolute that you could hear the fabric of Madison's ruined wedding dress rustling against the floor as she trembled. The agent did not raise his voice, but his tone carried the undeniable lethal weight of federal authority. "Nobody moves and nobody leaves this building until we have concluded our business," he announced, scanning the terrified faces of the crowd. He lowered his badge and locked his piercing eyes directly onto my son and his wife, who were still cowering on the floor. The raid was executed with flawless, terrifying precision. They had completely surrounded the building, cutting off any possible escape route for the two criminals who thought they could outsmart the law. I stood quietly near the stage, watching the absolute destruction of their arrogant empire unfold exactly as my attorney and I had planned. The trap had not just closed, it had slammed shut with the crushing force of federal justice. The lead agent marched straight past the trembling investors and stopped directly in front of David and Madison. He gestured to two officers who immediately stepped forward, unhooking the heavy steel handcuffs from their utility belts. The sharp metallic clicking sound of the cuffs being readied echoed sharply through the dead silent room. David Jenkins, the agent, declared, reading from a thick folded warrant, "The state of New York and the Federal Bureau of Investigation are placing you under immediate arrest. You are being charged with grand forgery, felony, elder abuse, and criminal conspiracy to commit wire fraud." David let out a gut-wrenching, pathetic wail. He did not try to stand up or defend himself. He simply collapsed completely flat onto his stomach, sobbing into the hardwood floor as the officers yanked his arms violently behind his back. The heavy steel cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, locking him into his new reality. He wept like a broken child, begging the officers to let him go, swearing that he was manipulated, that he never wanted to hurt his father. His pathetic cries fell on completely deaf ears. The lead agent immediately turned his attention to Madison, who was hyperventilating and trying to crawl backward away from the approaching officers. "Madison Jenkins, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, attempted extortion, criminal conspiracy, and malicious filing of a false government report." The agent announced, his voice loud enough for every single elite investor to hear her crimes. Madison did not surrender like David. She completely lost her mind. As the officers grabbed her arms, she turned feral. She kicked her expensive heels wildly into the air, screaming obscenities and fighting with the frantic energy of a cornered rat. "Let me go," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Do you know how much money I have? You cannot do this to me. I am a business owner. This is my gala." She thrashed and twisted, trying to bite the officer securing her right arm. The officers did not hesitate. They swiftly and forcefully wrestled her to the ground, pinning her against the floor until the steel cuffs clicked tightly around her wrists. Her pristine white gown was torn and smeared with dirt. Her perfectly styled hair was a frantic, tangled mess across her face. They hauled her roughly to her feet. She screamed at the wealthy investors, begging them to call their lawyers, demanding that someone intervene and save her. The socialites simply stared back at her with absolute disgust, pulling their coats tighter around themselves to avoid touching her as the police dragged her down the aisle. She kicked and thrashed her heels, scraping loudly against the polished wood, her shrieks echoing out into the cold night air as they forced her out the front doors and shoved her directly into the back of a waiting police cruiser. David was dragged out right behind her, his head hanging low, weeping uncontrollably, unable to even look me in the eye as he was led away in chains. The chaos of the arrests left the remaining guests in a state of breathless shock. But before the lead FBI agent could turn to address the crowd, two figures violently pushed their way to the front of the room. It was Richard and Victoria Madison's wealthy elitist parents. They had been standing near the back of the boutique, entirely paralyzed by the sudden raid, but seeing their daughter dragged away in handcuffs had finally snapped them out of their stupor. They marched right up to the lead federal agent, their faces red with indignant, arrogant fury. They still believed that their immense wealth and their skin color granted them absolute immunity from the consequences of the law. Richard puffed out his chest, trying to physically intimidate the federal agent. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he bellowed, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "Do you have any idea who we are? We are upper-class citizens. We have powerful friends in the mayor's office. You cannot just storm into our daughter's business and drag her away like a common street thug. I will have your badge for this. I will sue this entire department into bankruptcy." Victoria stood right beside him, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "This is all a setup by that vindictive old man," she screeched. "He is insane. Our daughter was trying to protect him, and you are arresting the wrong people." The lead FBI agent did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or argue with their arrogant demands. He simply stared at Richard and Victoria with a look of profound, absolute pity. He reached inside his tactical windbreaker and pulled out a secure, encrypted digital tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and held the device up between them. "Let us talk about who you really are," the agent said calmly. He pressed a button on the screen. Instantly, the crystal-clear audio recording I had captured in my living room began to play aloud for everyone to hear. Richard's arrogant voice echoed from the tablet, loudly filling the quiet boutique. "Take the money, sign the deed of this house over to us to save our daughter, and go back to the ghetto projects where your kind belongs." The recording captured every single vile racist slur, every threat of extortion, and every demand for my property deed. The color instantly and completely drained from Richard's face. Victoria gasped, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. The audio recording finished playing, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in its wake. The wealthy investors in the room stared at Richard and Victoria with absolute horror, completely repulsed by the vile extortion they had just heard. The elite facade of the wealthy parents shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their peers. The lead FBI agent slowly lowered the tablet and slid it back into his tactical jacket. He looked at the trembling couple and smiled a cold, deeply grim smile. "We know exactly who you are," he whispered, his voice slicing through their remaining arrogance like a razor blade. "We know you tried to use $50,000 to extort a $2 million property from an elderly man to cover up a federal crime." Richard tried to take a step backward, but two federal agents immediately moved in and blocked his path. "You are both under immediate arrest for accessory to federal extortion and conspiracy to commit real estate fraud," the lead agent announced. "Turn around and put your hands behind your backs." The nightmare they thought they could buy their way out of had just swallowed them whole. 3 days had passed since the absolute chaos inside the fashion boutique. The dust was finally beginning to settle, but the nightmare for my arrogant in-laws was just getting started. Richard and Victoria had managed to scrape together enough liquid cash to post their exorbitant bail and secure their temporary release from the federal holding center. They returned to their sprawling, immaculate suburban mansion, completely terrified, but still desperately clinging to their deeply ingrained arrogance. They truly believed that their immense wealth could build an impenetrable wall between them and the consequences of their actions. They sat in their lavish home office surrounded by expensive imported art and leather furniture, trying to strategize their way out of a federal indictment. Richard paced back and forth across the Persian rug, wiping the cold sweat from his forehead. He assured his trembling wife that they would simply hire the most ruthless, high-powered defense attorneys in the entire country. He promised her that they would throw millions of dollars at the best legal team money could buy to save their daughter Madison and keep themselves out of a federal prison cell. He told Victoria not to worry, claiming that I was nothing but a lucky old man who had caught them off guard, and that their elite lawyers would easily destroy my credibility in court. They needed a massive amount of liquid capital immediately to pay the massive retainer fees those elite law firms demanded. Richard sat down in his heavy mahogany leather chair and opened his expensive laptop. He was fully prepared to liquidate a massive portion of his extensive stock portfolio. He pulled out his gold reading glasses and navigated to his premier wealth management portal, typing in his secure credentials with frantic, trembling fingers. He fully expected to see the comforting sight of his multi-million-dollar balances ready to be transferred and weaponized against me. He hit the enter key and waited for the screen to load, anticipating the safety of his immense fortune. He thought he was still the untouchable king of his elite world, completely unaware that the federal government had already dropped a massive invisible net directly over his entire life. The screen of his expensive laptop loaded for a brief second before a bright, flashing red message appeared across the display. The words "access denied" stared back at him in bold, unforgiving letters. Richard frowned, thinking he had simply typed his complex password incorrectly. He re-entered his credentials, his breathing growing slightly heavier, and pressed the key again. The exact same red warning flashed across the screen. "Error code account suspended. Contact your financial institution immediately." A cold knot of pure panic began to form deep in his stomach. Victoria stood behind him, gripping the back of his leather chair, asking him what was wrong. Richard did not answer her. He quickly opened a new tab and navigated to the portal for their secondary offshore banking accounts. He typed furiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. Access denied. He tried his private retirement accounts. Access denied. He tried the business accounts linked to his holding company. Suspended. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking as pale as a ghost. He grabbed his cell phone with shaking hands and dialed the direct private number of his elite personal broker. The phone rang 3 times before the broker finally answered. The broker's voice did not sound warm or welcoming like it usually did when speaking to a multimillionaire client. Instead, the broker sounded absolutely terrified and completely distant. Richard began to yell into the receiver, demanding to know why all of his accounts were suddenly locked out and ordering the broker to release his funds immediately to pay his legal team. The broker stopped him mid-sentence with a tone of absolute finality. The broker explained that he could not move a single penny. He told Richard that the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Justice had stepped in early that morning. Because Richard and Victoria had been caught on a crystal-clear audio recording committing federal extortion, and because their daughter Madison's crimes involved interstate bank fraud and severe financial entanglements with a known underground criminal syndicate, the government had escalated the charges. The broker explained that the federal prosecutors had officially invoked the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the RICO laws. It is a devastating legal hammer designed to completely dismantle organized criminal enterprises. The broker told a weeping Richard that a federal judge had signed a sweeping order placing a permanent and immediate freeze on every single asset they possessed. Every penny in their bank accounts, every share of stock, every offshore trust, every luxury vehicle, and the very mansion they were currently standing inside had been officially seized by the federal government as the direct proceeds of a criminal conspiracy. They had absolutely zero access to their wealth. They could not sell a single share. They could not transfer a dime. The broker hung up the phone, leaving Richard listening to the dead dial tone. The reality of their total absolute destruction crashed down upon them like a suffocating avalanche. They were completely cut off from the one thing that gave them power. They could not even use their platinum credit cards to buy a cup of coffee at a corner store. Victoria collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably as she realized that their money, their status, and their elite protection had vanished into thin air. The invisible shield of their wealth had been entirely shattered, leaving them completely exposed to the harsh, brutal reality of the justice system they had always believed they were above. They were trapped in a mansion they no longer truly owned, staring down the barrel of a devastating federal prosecution with absolutely nothing to their name. The once arrogant elite family was suddenly and violently rendered absolutely penniless. The consequences of their boundless greed and their blatant racism had stripped them of everything they held dear. When they tried to go to the grocery store later that week, their luxury credit cards were declined at the register, forcing them to leave their groceries behind while other customers stared at them in pity. When they tried to drive away, federal agents were already waiting in the parking lot to impound their brand new silver Mercedes-Benz right in front of the entire neighborhood. They were forced to take a public bus back to a house that was scheduled for government seizure. Without their millions of dollars to pay for a high-powered, aggressive defense team, Richard and Victoria experienced the ultimate humiliation. They had to walk into the crowded, noisy public courthouse and stand in a long line with ordinary people they used to despise. They were forced to swallow their massive pride and formally request the assistance of an overworked, underpaid public defender to save them from spending the rest of their lives in a federal penitentiary. Madison sat in her holding cell, waiting for her parents to bail her out with their endless wealth, completely unaware that her family was now just as broke and desperate as the people she used to mock. While their entire world burned to the ground, I was sitting in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary of my private study. The morning sun was shining brightly through the large bay windows, casting a warm, comforting glow across the polished oak desk. I held a steaming mug of dark roast coffee in my hands, letting the rich, bitter aroma fill the room. The house was finally completely silent. There were no arrogant voices demanding my property. There were no deceitful children sneaking into my bedroom in the dead of night. There were no threats and no lies. I reached over and turned on the small television resting on my bookshelf, switching it to the local morning news broadcast. The news anchor appeared on the screen looking serious as she reported on the spectacular overnight downfall of a prominent local elite family. I watched as footage played of federal agents carrying boxes of documents out of Richard's massive suburban mansion. The anchor detailed the massive federal fraud sweep and the total bankruptcy of the criminals who had tried to steal my life. I took a slow, satisfying sip of my hot coffee. I did not cheer or gloat. I did not need to celebrate like a fool. I simply sat back in my comfortable leather chair and enjoyed the profound, absolute silence of my home, fully knowing that the quiet, heavy hand of justice had been served exactly as I had planned. 6 months had passed since the night the federal raid shattered the glass doors of the luxury boutique and tore the arrogant masks off my treacherous family. 6 long, quiet months of legal proceedings, depositions, and the slow, inevitable grinding of the absolute justice system. I sat perfectly still in the very first row of the massive federal courtroom wearing a freshly tailored dark navy suit and a crisp white shirt. The heavy oak benches were polished to a high shine, and the air in the room felt thick with the gravity of the impending judgment. The large wooden double doors beside the judge's bench swung open with a loud, heavy clank that echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. 2 armed federal marshals marched into the room, leading the prisoners toward the defense tables. My eyes locked onto the 2 figures shuffling across the floor. It was David and Madison, but they were entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant elite couple who had tried to steal my home and my sanity. They were both wearing oversized, bright orange prison jumpsuits that completely swallowed their frames. The designer clothes, the expensive jewelry, and the flawless makeup were all permanently gone. Madison looked like a hollow ghost. Her bright blonde hair had lost all of its shine and hung limply around her pale, sunken face. The profound stress of facing a decade behind bars had aged her 20 years in a matter of months. She kept her eyes glued to the scuffed floor tiles, completely terrified to look up at the gallery. David walked behind her, his shoulders completely slumped forward in absolute total defeat. The heavy steel chains around his ankles clinked sharply with every single hesitant step he took. The man who had forged my signature to satisfy violent loan sharks now looked like a broken, pathetic shell. He had lost his youth, he had lost his freedom, and most importantly, he had lost the father who had sacrificed everything for him. They were directed to sit down at the heavy wooden defense tables next to their overworked public defenders. They had no elite legal team to save them because their parents' assets were still completely frozen by the federal government. They were completely alone, entirely stripped of their unearned power, and waiting to hear the exact price they would have to pay for their boundless greed. The heavy wooden gavel slammed down against the sounding block with a sharp, violent crack that made both David and Madison flinch in their seats. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising man with decades of experience on the bench, stared down at them from his elevated position. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked over the massive stack of evidentiary files that documented every single lie, every forged signature, and every cruel manipulation they had attempted to execute against me. The courtroom was so incredibly silent that you could hear the soft humming of the air conditioning vents. The judge did not hold back. He began to speak, and his voice carried the heavy, lethal weight of absolute moral and legal authority. He addressed Madison first. He stripped away any remaining illusion that she was a victim of circumstance. He laid out her crimes in agonizing detail, stating that she was the absolute mastermind behind the malicious attempt to falsely imprison a perfectly sane elderly man simply to steal a $4.5 million heirloom. He noted her fraudulent investment gala and her total disregard for human decency. He highlighted how she showed absolutely no remorse when trying to destroy an innocent life for pure financial gain. Madison Jenkins, the judge, announced, his voice booming through the silent room, for the charges of federal bank fraud, attempted extortion, and criminal conspiracy to commit elder abuse, I sentence you to 10 years in a federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Madison let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. Her knees buckled beneath the table, and she collapsed forward, weeping uncontrollably into her shackled hands. 10 years of her life were instantly wiped away. The elite socialite was officially a convicted federal felon who would spend the next decade staring at concrete walls, completely stripped of her freedom and her identity. The judge then slowly turned his piercing gaze directly toward my son. David was already trembling violently, tears streaming continuously down his pale cheeks. He looked up at the judge with wide, desperate eyes, begging for a mercy he absolutely did not deserve. He was waiting for some kind of leniency, hoping that the court would see him as a manipulated pawn rather than a willing participant. But the court saw exactly what I saw: a coward. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the heavy oak bench. He looked at David not just as a criminal, but as a profound moral failure. David Jenkins, the judge said, his tone dropping to a low, disgusted whisper that chilled the entire room. You forged your own father's signature to satisfy violent underground criminals. You stood by like a coward while your wife plotted to lock him in a psychiatric ward. You stole from the very man who worked his entire life to provide you with every possible advantage. You traded your morality for cheap convenience. The judge paused, letting the absolute silence amplify the devastating truth of his words. He looked directly into David's weeping eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. Your betrayal of a father's love is the most despicable act I have seen in my entire judicial career. The judge raised his gavel high into the air once again. For the charges of grand forgery and severe elder abuse, I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison. The gavel slammed down again, sealing their fates forever. 7 years of absolute total loss. 7 years to sit in a tiny metal cage and think about the father he had permanently destroyed. The sound of the judge's gavel hitting the sounding block felt like the closing of a massive, heavy vault door. The legal proceedings were officially concluded, and the weight of justice settled over the room. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing Madison and David by their upper arms and hauling them roughly to their feet. Madison was completely hysterical and entirely unable to walk on her own as the officers practically dragged her toward the side holding cell door. She wailed loudly, her desperate cries echoing off the high courtroom walls, but absolutely nobody in the gallery offered her a single ounce of sympathy. She had dug her own grave with her boundless arrogance, and now she was being thrown directly into it. David was pulled up right behind her. As the marshals turned him around to lead him toward the heavy steel doors, he desperately searched the front row of the gallery. His red, swollen eyes frantically scanned the crowd of spectators until they finally locked onto mine. I was sitting perfectly still, my face carved from absolute solid stone. I did not offer him a smile. I did not offer him a frown or a look of anger. I gave him absolutely nothing but the cold, hollow emptiness he had thoroughly earned through his betrayals. He stumbled slightly, his heavy leg chains clanking loudly against the polished floorboards. He looked at my face, and the total realization of his absolute permanent loss washed over his broken features. He knew deep in his soul that there would be no more second chances. There would be no prison visits, no phone calls to check on him, and absolutely no letters from me. The father who had loved him, the father who had protected him from the cruelties of the world, was completely gone forever. As the marshals pulled him through the dark doorway, David turned his head over his shoulder, looking at me one very last time. His lips trembled violently. He mouthed 2 silent, pathetic words through his tears. I am sorry. He wanted absolution. He wanted me to nod or show a single flicker of forgiveness to ease the crushing guilt that would haunt him for the next 7 years of his miserable life in a concrete box. I did not give it to him. I calmly stood up from the heavy oak bench. I reached down and methodically buttoned my immaculate tailored suit jacket with absolute perfect precision. I smoothed out the fine fabric, making sure not a single crease remained on my clothing. I turned my back to the holding cell door, completely erasing his existence from my mind. I walked straight up the center aisle of the courtroom, my polished shoes clicking steadily and rhythmically against the floor. I pushed open the massive double doors and stepped out into the bright, warm sunlight of the city, completely leaving the past behind me without a single backward glance. The morning air was crisp and completely still. I sat alone on the polished wooden bench in the center of my backyard garden. The vibrant red rose bushes that my beautiful wife Vivian had planted so many decades ago were in full bloom. Their sweet, familiar fragrance drifted through the quiet space, filling my lungs with a profound sense of absolute peace. The storm that had violently torn through my life over the past 6 months was finally over. The house behind me stood perfectly silent. There were no arrogant voices echoing down the hallways demanding my property. There were no deceitful footsteps creeping past my bedroom door in the dead of night. The heavy, suffocating dark cloud of betrayal had been permanently lifted from my home. I leaned back against the smooth wood and closed my eyes, letting the warm, golden sunlight wash over my face. I rested my hands in my lap. Resting safely in the center of my right palm was the Vacheron Constantin pocket watch. The solid platinum casing felt comfortably heavy and pleasantly warm from the morning sun. I slowly opened my eyes and looked down at the masterpiece. I traced my thumb over the intricate, flawless engravings on the front cover. I pressed the small release latch, and the casing popped open with a satisfying mechanical click. I watched the tiny precision gears spinning flawlessly inside the watch. The hidden internal diamonds sparkled brilliantly, catching the morning light and throwing tiny, dazzling reflections across the dark fabric of my trousers. But it was not the breathtaking financial value of the gems that brought me comfort. It was the sound. The steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique mechanism was so incredibly quiet but so undeniably strong. Tick, tick, tick. It sounded exactly like the heartbeat of an unbroken survivor. It sounded like the relentless march of absolute justice. I listened to that perfect mechanical rhythm and felt a deep, profound connection to the generations of strong, resilient men and women who came before me. I thought about Vivian's grandfather, who endured unimaginable hardships on the railroads just to secure this single piece of undeniable dignity for his family. He passed it down through the bloodline as a silent promise that our legacy would never be erased by the greed or cruelty of others. I had kept that sacred promise. I had faced the absolute worst kind of betrayal from my own flesh and blood, and I had not allowed them to steal the dignity that rightfully belonged to my family history. The garden was perfectly quiet again. I took a deep breath and looked up at the clear blue sky, knowing that my house was finally completely cleansed of the poison that had tried to consume it. The peaceful silence of the garden was gently interrupted by the sound of the heavy wooden side gate opening. I did not need to turn my head to know who was walking down the stone pathway. My lead corporate attorney Garrison approached me with his usual measured professional stride. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit carrying a massive, thick leather briefcase in his right hand. He did not look like a man coming to deliver bad news. He looked like a man coming to finalize a monumental victory. He stopped in front of the wooden bench and offered me a deep, respectful nod. "Good morning, Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I have brought the final legal documents you requested." I nodded and gestured for him to sit down beside me on the bench. Garrison popped the brass latches on his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal papers bound in a dark blue folder. He placed them carefully onto the small wrought iron table resting between us. He handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. The papers sitting in front of me were the official binding transfer documents for the $15 million family trust fund. The massive fortune that Madison and David had tried to steal was about to be permanently locked away from any greedy hands forever. I looked down at the first page. The bold black letters at the top of the document officially established the creation of the Vivian Jenkins Foundation. I took the gold pen from Garrison and signed my name on the dotted line with absolute, unwavering certainty. With that single stroke of ink, the entire $15 million trust was legally and irrevocably transferred into the new charitable organization. I flipped to the next page and signed again. Garrison watched me with quiet, profound respect as I executed the final stages of my master plan. We had spent weeks drafting the specific legally binding bylaws of the foundation. The millions of dollars would not just sit in a bank account gathering interest. The Vivian Jenkins Foundation was explicitly designed to provide massive full-ride law school scholarships. But these scholarships were not for just anyone. The money was strictly allocated to support brilliant, highly driven African-American students who demonstrated exceptional academic excellence and a fierce commitment to justice. The trust fund would pay for their entire legal education, their housing, and their living expenses at the top law schools in the country. In exchange for this completely free elite education, every single recipient had to sign a legally binding pledge. They had to commit the first 5 years of their legal careers to specializing in elder law and providing free, aggressive legal defense for vulnerable senior citizens who were facing family abuse, fraud, and extortion. I signed the very last page of the document and handed the thick folder back to Garrison. The wealth that my son tried to hand over to violent loan sharks was now going to fund an entire army of elite, ruthless young lawyers. These brilliant students would walk into courtrooms across the country and completely dismantle the arrogant predators who try to steal from the elderly. They would be the shield that I had to build for myself. Garrison carefully placed the signed documents back into his leather briefcase and locked the brass latches. "It is completely finalized, Mr. Chairman," he said. "The foundation is officially fully funded and legally impenetrable. Your legacy is absolutely secure." I smiled and looked back down at the platinum watch still ticking softly in the palm of my hand. I looked out across the vibrant green lawn of my garden, and a deep, warm smile slowly spread across my face. It was the first genuine, completely unguarded smile I had allowed myself to feel in over 6 months. I did not just protect my hard-earned wealth from 2 pathetic, greedy criminals. I achieved something vastly more important than protecting a bank account. I had successfully and absolutely protected the sacred honor of my beautiful wife. Vivian was a woman of immense grace and boundless dignity. She had poured her entire heart and soul into building our family only to have her memory disrespected and her treasures mocked by an arrogant woman who understood absolutely nothing about true value. Madison had looked at a priceless piece of our rich family history and sneeringly called it cheap, fake silver. She had casually dismissed a masterpiece because she was completely blinded by her own elite prejudice and superficial greed. But that very same watch, the watch she wanted me to throw into the trash, had just become the cornerstone of a massive, unstoppable movement. Because of her arrogant mistake, that piece of supposed cheap silver had permanently secured a legal and financial legacy that would continue to fight for justice for generations to come. Long after I am gone, and long after David and Madison are completely forgotten in their tiny prison cells, the Vivian Jenkins Foundation will still be standing strong. Dozens of brilliant young lawyers will walk into federal courtrooms carrying my wife's name into battle. They will protect the weak, they will defend the forgotten, and they will crush the greedy. I closed the platinum casing of the pocket watch with a sharp, satisfying click. I slid the heavy, beautiful masterpiece back into the inside pocket of my tailored suit jacket, resting it right next to my heart. The morning sun climbed higher into the bright blue sky, washing the entire garden in a glorious, warm light. I took one last deep breath of the sweet, fragrant air, completely satisfied with the work I had done. I stood up from the wooden bench, feeling stronger and more alive than I had in 20 years, and walked slowly back into my quiet, peaceful home. 5 years have passed since the heavy steel doors of the federal penitentiary permanently closed on my cowardly son and his arrogant wife. I am 80 years old now, and the world has continued to spin, but it spins a little differently today. This morning, I sat quietly in the back row of a crowded county courthouse, watching a brilliant young African-American woman stand proudly before a judge. Her name is Maya, and she is the very first graduating scholar of the Vivian Jenkins Foundation. She grew up in the same tough, unforgiving neighborhoods that Vivian and I did. She knew exactly how to fight for what was right. Maya stood tall and unyielding in her dark tailored suit, defending an 82-year-old man whose own greedy children had tried to secretly sell his family farm and lock him away in a state-run nursing home. I watched Maya methodically dismantle their fraudulent medical documents piece by piece, just like my lawyer Garrison had done for me. She spoke with a cold, fierce legal precision that made the predatory family physically tremble in their seats. When the judge brought his wooden gavel down, dismissing the fraudulent conservatorship and ordering the immediate arrest of the deceitful children, Maya turned around and looked directly at me. She offered a deep, respectful nod, acknowledging the legacy that made her victory possible. She had just saved an innocent man's life and secured his home. The millions of dollars Madison tried to steal from me had successfully funded the exact weapon needed to crush predators just like her. The foundation was no longer just a piece of paper in a briefcase. It was a living, breathing shield for the vulnerable, ensuring that no elder would ever have to face their treacherous family members alone. Later that evening, I returned to the absolute quiet peace of my home. I walked out onto the back porch and lowered myself into my favorite wooden rocking chair. The vast sky was painted in deep, rich shades of burning orange and soft purple as the sun slowly began to set over the distant horizon. I looked out over the perfectly manicured lawn and the vibrant, blooming rose bushes, taking in the complete silence of my sanctuary. The evening air was cool and crisp, but a sudden warm, gentle breeze brushed against my weathered face, carrying the faint, familiar scent of the specific flowers Vivian loved so much. I closed my eyes and smiled, letting the comforting warmth wash over my tired bones. I knew with absolute certainty that Vivian was looking down at me from above, smiling brightly at the magnificent legacy we had built and protected together. We had started our journey with nothing but calloused hands and an unbreakable will to survive in a society that constantly tried to push us down. We faced decades of brutal hardship and systemic prejudice, but we built an impenetrable fortress of wealth and profound respect. When my own flesh and blood tried to tear that fortress to the ground to please a woman blinded by elitist prejudice, I did not let them win. I proved to them and to the entire city that true human dignity cannot be bought, bullied, or stolen. I proved that blatant disrespect and cruel arrogance come with a devastating, inescapable price. David and Madison traded their freedom, their marriage, and their entire future for a worthless $50 replica watch, while the real treasure remained perfectly safe. They are sitting in their cold, damp concrete cells tonight, entirely stripped of their names and their luxury, while I am sitting on my beautiful porch breathing the free, open air. I did not have to scream or beg for my survival. I simply let their own boundless greed dig their graves, and then I quietly handed them the shovels. The justice I served was absolute and permanent. I leaned back into the comfortable cushions of the rocking chair and let out a long, slow breath of complete satisfaction. I reached inside the front pocket of my soft cardigan and pulled out the solid platinum Vacheron Constantin pocket watch. The heavy antique metal felt incredibly familiar and deeply grounding as it rested in the palm of my hand. I brought the masterpiece up and placed it gently against my chest, right over my beating heart. In the deep, soothing quiet of the evening, the only sound left in the entire world was the steady mechanical rhythm of the flawless antique mechanism. Tick, tick, tick. It was a beautiful, flawless sound. It was the sound of ultimate patience. It was the sound of an unbroken truth that had survived the test of time and the treacherous hands of arrogant thieves. Madison had looked at this magnificent piece of our proud history and sneeringly called it cheap fake silver. She let her toxic prejudice blind her to the immense generational value sitting right in front of her face. But the watch had completely outlasted her blinding arrogance. It had easily outlasted my son's pathetic cowardice. The hidden internal diamonds continued to sparkle in the dark, unseen, but eternally valuable. The watch continues to tick, moving forward second by second, completely indifferent to the noise and the chaos of the greedy world outside my gates. I closed my eyes and listened to the perfect, flawless rhythm, letting it lull me into a state of profound, well-deserved rest. The foundation is thriving, and the predators are locked away where they belong. My life work is finally complete. I am Clifford Jenkins, and I have fully secured my peace. Tick, tick, tick. The ultimate silent justice. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true wealth and power do not need to shout to be heard. Arrogance and greed will always blind people to the real value of what is right in front of them. Madison and David looked at a lifetime of sacrifice and saw only something to exploit. They mistook a father's quiet patience for weakness. But respect and dignity are the true currencies of life. When you treat people as disposable, you ultimately destroy your own future. Family should be built on loyalty, not leverage. Always remember that the quietest people often hold the greatest strength. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more powerful stories of justice and resilience.